Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Hey!
Good afternoon, and welcome to a special workshop meeting. And thank you, Beth, for kicking it off. Today is November 16th. This is a special workshop meeting of the City Council for the City of Oak Harbor. We have a busy schedule today. We're going to start off with a couple of presentations. Before we do that, I'd like to welcome the viewing audience and those in our those especially staff members and citizens out here joining us today. Thank you. We'll quick go around the table and introduce those council people that are here. Looks like we have a full council, and then we'll come back to our first presentation. So I'm Bob Severance, Mayor.
Joel Servadius, City Council.
Rick Holmberg, City Council. Doug Merriman, City Administrator.
Beth Munn, City Council.
Erica Wassinger, City Council.
Tara Hizon, City Council.
And our first presentation today is Cheryn Weiser from the Island Senior Resources.
Take it away.
Take it away, Cheryn.
All right. Well, I want to start by acknowledging that much of what I have in here in terms of statistics and stuff, because I'm really here to update you, to really give you a sense of what we've been up to and how that relates to North Whidbey. But I want to give a couple of highlights of hot off the press information. Yesterday was the typical day that we have a Thanksgiving meal at the Oak Harbor Senior Center. And my understanding is there were 54 people there enjoying a wonderful Thanksgiving lunch. So that's always a special time for everybody. We'll be having another one of those just before Christmas. The other little hot off the press piece is that, as you may know, we started an adult day program again here in Oak Harbor in April. And that is just running one day a week right now. It is full. We have a waiting list. And as we've been developing our 2018 budget, we are making plans to expand that in February to 2 days a week, so that we'll move to Mondays in February, and we'll move to adding Fridays in June. We feel very confident that we've begun to lay the kind of groundwork here that is necessary to be able to fill those days with the waiting list we've already got. So that's very exciting. We've had a really strong response to that renewal of that program here, and we thank Liz Lang and the council and Mayor Severance, Doug, for being able to host us again here and being able to provide that service. So mostly I wanted to just walk through some information that most of you probably have in terms of where we are with demographics. As you may be fully aware, it seems like we're running into more white-haired people in wherever we go in this island county community, and we're at about 25%, just under 25% now of the island county community is over 65, and the projection by 2021 is 40% are projected to be over 55. So we've got higher percentage in other parts of our island county community, but still that's a growing factor here. And as I'll demonstrate to you shortly, we're certainly providing, in some cases, a disproportionate amount of service here in North Whidbey to other parts of the county. In the first 9 months of this year, and there's an error in that first one. In the first 9 months, we have an aging and disabled resources kind of contact location here in Camino and on South Whidbey, and we ended up already serving, it should say 147%, not 1%, 147% of the annual goal for 2017 in terms of number of contacts. So I think that says something about the fact that we're seeing the baby boomers come our way, and we're receiving just way more contacts in terms of needs for information about whatever, whether it's long-term care, whether it's about Medicare, Social Security, whether it's about other kinds of issues that seniors may be facing in terms of housing, all of those things at once. There is an increase, particularly here, in the use of Meals on Wheels. And medical transportation, as you'll see in a couple of minutes, is highly used, particularly here in North Whidbey. And we have a waiting list right now of over 30 people, and that's been true all year long for the low-income housing at Cambay Apartments in Coupeville. We've had it as high as 37%. So moving to the next one. Sorry, I'm just getting on board here.
Want me to do your slides
We've got
for you?
nowhere else to be.
Do you want to? You probably are much better at this than I am. Thanks, Doug. So there's just a quick look at the percentage on the next page of those over 60. And we just tend to be much higher. And one of the things that I think it's really important to look at on the next slide is that we just have a larger number per thousand of people over 65 than many of our compatriot counties. And one of the dynamics that plays out in terms of our funding is that our funding through the Northwest Regional Council really is by total population. It's not by seniors. So we get a prorated amount based on that population data, even though the total number of seniors that we're serving is more. So we're serving more seniors with basically less money than some other counties would be using. And again, there's another that shows you sort of the distribution in terms of by age, over 65, over 60 actually. So what I know over the years that I've come before the council, there's been an increased interest in really knowing pretty clearly what are we doing up here, so that you really had a sense of what that was. And we've gotten better and better at being able to carve that out. It's not the way that we tend to submit our statistical information to our funding sources, so it's taken us some tease out time, but we're there. So you see North Whidbey is really Coupeville and Oak Harbor, and South Whidbey is Clinton, Langley, Freeland, and Greenbank, and then we've got also Camino Island, so we're serving all of that. But if you look at the next slide on medical transportation, it's a huge story, and I think this is a story that, for those of you who've been on the council for a while, probably heard me say this before. We provide the lion's share of medical transportation to people who are either disabled or over 65 here in North Whidbey. Yeah.
Isn't part of that, wouldn't that be because the largest concentration of population is here on the north end? And there are houses that, I mean, people have been in their houses for 50 years, so
That very
they're
well
not going to
could
be moving to the south end.
Well, but it is like 70%
Yeah.
of what we do is here. And as I think we've talked before, many times we're drawing on volunteers from Coupeville and South to be able to provide the services here. Because there aren't the proportion of volunteers is not commensurate with the demand here. So and again, the second slide is just another way of displaying the same information, which you'll see repeated throughout this. So as for congregate meals, it's pretty par between here and the south end. There are more stops in the south end. We've got some volunteer locations that also run, but we have Oak Harbor, and we also Senior Center, and we also have the Methodist Church in Coupeville and our Cambay site, which all blend into that North Whidbey amount. But what you will see is that there's a higher amount on the next page in terms of home delivered meals. So again, you're seeing more, and that demand is going up this year, and has for the last 3 years. The home delivered meal demand is increasing. And as you are probably fully aware, that is a service that really helps people stay in their homes. It really allows them to live out their lives in their place of choice for a lot longer. And it is also that safety net because our volunteers go 3 days a week and can check in on these people, and it may be the only person they see all week. The other thing to note about that is that we're holding on to this fiercely, and thanks to wonderful volunteers, because in places like King County, they now deliver 7 frozen meals once a week to people who are receiving home delivered meals in King County. So you're not having the kind of safety net, the kind of social connection that we offer, and they're not being delivered hot meals. So there's a whole total meal count on the next following page.
So Cheryn,
Yeah,
on that one, you have people going out daily then, volunteers?
3 days a week.
3 days a week?
Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
Okay.
So that if an individual wants a frozen meal for the off days, but we have hot meals 3 days a week. Yeah. So there's an overall slide there on the map in terms of the nutrition piece too. So Aging and Disabled Resources, formerly known as Senior Information Assistance, really includes now something called Family Caregiver Support, which is a new kind of stream. Right now, this is 2016 stats, and I can tell you that as of 2017, at the end of October, this North Whitby piece would be higher than the South Whitby, because we've seen a real escalation of the number of contacts here in Oak Harbor. And we are very grateful to a very good staff person who is unbelievably productive up here in terms of keeping that going. So, and in my view, I think this is the service that is most critical because it really directs people to resources so that they can take care of themselves, or that their caregiver can find help, or the neighbor who's concerned about a particular individual or family member or whomever has some way of locating resources for the particular issue that senior is experiencing. And you see on the next graph that Oak Harbor is right up there with Whatcom County in terms of staff who's providing the amount of service. It's really pretty amazing what's happening here in Oak Harbor related to contacts with folks in need. Here's the family caregiver support model, and I think it's really important for, if you haven't been familiar with this, this is a program that was started by the state several years ago, and has recently sort of married some Medicaid funding with this program and state funding to expand it. It really is designed to help caregivers be able to keep their person within their home and get the kind of support that the caregiver needs to be able to do that. So there's a pretty intensive process that people go through to be able to get a whole range of services. Respite care, as an example, to provide them with the ability to maintain their care, their person that they're caregiving for at home. Case management, again, and just to be clear about what case management is, most of the people who are on our roster for case managed services, and we're only providing those on South and North Whitby now, because the whole service network is different on Camino, and we changed that around, so that's being taken care of through Snohomish County at this point. But people who are on this caseload are those who might otherwise be in institutions. So this is a lower cost alternative for folks who might be in nursing homes, assisted living, family homes, whatever, where we're helping to case manage so that they are able to stay in an alternative, a home, a community-based facility. So it's pretty intensive work, but the predominance of those are also on North Whitby.
Sharon,
Yeah.
sorry, if you don't mind me interrupting.
Sure.
Camino Island has 0
Yeah.
for case management. Is there maybe an MOU or something with Stanwood, or is that just?
That is really
Like
handled,
me.
since our primary funding source is Northwest Regional Council.
Mhm.
And a couple years ago, because of the demand for other services over there, we asked that they look at pulling that amount of the caseload and putting it either with Snohomish or Skagit so that we could increase our capacity to serve in the family caregiver support and information and assistance with our person on Camino. So that's what they did. So that's why there's nothing there.
That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. So just quickly, our funding streams, again, it's about 55% that is government funding. And we receive a little bit from Coopville and from Langley. We receive the support of space from you folks with a little bit of rent coming your way. And then we have a whole array of other components to this. Everything from our thrift store, which, by the way, I want to announce, if you did know that we had a fire on July 23rd, which I never thought I was going to know so much about fires and restoration and so forth. We are, our grand opening, new grand opening, will be on Black Friday, November 24th. And we were told that it was going to take us at least 6 months, maybe 9, and it'll be 4 months and 1 day. I am just thrilled, and so is everybody else. So come on down. It's an amazing renewal that we've had down there.
Where's the thrift store?
It's right on 525 on the north end of Freeland. Yeah, right on the highway there, right on Woodard Avenue and 525. But it is such a community effort, and all hands on deck, and all the contractors we've worked with have been amazing in sort of buying off on our mission and saying, sure, we'll do everything we can to get you open for the holiday season. So we're thrilled.
Sorry,
Yeah, please.
is this graph based on year to date or last year?
Last year.
Okay, so the thrift store profit of 219,
Was last year's.
so that's about 18,000 a month. Is that right?
Well,
Divided by
there's more
12,
than that.
and
I mean,
then-
that's the profit. So
Right.
there's
Right, but you're now down 4 months worth of that, so that's going to be significantly lower this year. Is that?
well,
sound
it
about
will
right?
be, but we had really good insurance coverage.
Oh, good.
So,
good to
and that's
hear.
part of why we're working the time frame to make sure, because there's a limit, there's a cap on that.
Okay.
But yeah, the additional gray hair I have this year has to do with it.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, and we actually, in the process of the restoration, are choosing to have our finance office, which used to be located there, is no longer going to be located there. We've got it in the facility that we had to occupy after the fire, and that space is going to be repurposed for additional retail space.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did, sorry, I'll let you
No,
finish
that's
in a
okay.
second.
Go.
Well, I just did the math, and based on 219, if you lose 4 months worth of operations, that's $73,000 that you didn't profit in retail sales. So that's pretty significant. So I'm glad that you're back up and running so quickly.
Yeah, well, and we do have an offset with the insurance coverage, and that also covered our staffing costs,
Good.
so that we didn't have to lose staff in the process too.
Fantastic.
So,
So
I'm done.
your total funding looks like it's about 2.2?
total funding is just under 3. Yeah. Yeah. So, we have contributions, fundraising of all events. That's part of what I'm sort of going from here to there this afternoon for, is an event that we've got down south this afternoon. We have different kinds of program revenue that comes through, including that $334,000 in part is some of the HUD funding that we get to. There's just, we're fairly complicated, is one way of putting it. We've got 13 different cost centers that we're monitoring at all times. So I want to leave time for questions and stuff. There's, I included a little SWOT that I had done that I think a couple of you saw this summer at the Council of Governments presentation that I made. But, you know, I guess one of the things I want to say is, you know, we've been doing this for 44 years. This is our 44th year of being under contract for these services. And we are the last not-for-profit organization in Northwest Washington to provide these services in a bundled fashion. In the other counties, meaning Whatcom, San Juan, and Skagit, you have some combination of government oversight of these programs and some subcontracts for some of these programs, but no longer is it all under one roof. So that's sort of what we're really working very hard to preserve. And I will say that, you know, I believe we have an outstanding staff and board and set of volunteers, and we're doing everything we can to keep innovating under not the easiest of circumstances in terms of flat government funding and the growth in the demographics. I mean, that we just can't control. It's happening right in front of our eyes. You know, one of the things that I think we've talked about before is that we've had some decline in, and we're not the only ones, in volunteer involvement. When I came to the organization in 2010, we had close to 450 volunteers. We've got 320 right now that are providing the same level or more service. So that's a challenge. I know several organizations, the county and United Way, and so some of us tried to get a volunteer kind of center created here several years ago, and that sort of went by the way because United Way was feeling like they were being cut back and could not sort of overtake it at the time. But it's still a need, I think. And there's lots of competition for those volunteers, as I think you are well aware. You know, we are always looking to our public leaders to be on deck for exerting some leadership on behalf of the seniors and disabled people in our community. So we're hoping that that will continue, and we're going to continue to innovate at every level that we possibly can, both on the service level and in providing more avenues for revenue generation, cost cutting. I mean, I cannot tell you how many ways we've done that. I give you a quick example. I was interviewed yesterday by PSE for an application that we have in to have a solar installation on our thrift store, which will reduce our need for energy. And we're hoping to hear positively about that in early December. So obviously threats, we don't know where federal funding really is going to be. But right now we think it's going to be fairly stable. So I'm sure you've heard about the housing process. We certainly have a housing crisis for older people in this county that is not meeting the need, hence the 37 person waiting list we've got at Cambay right now. But I have one particular member of the senior community that probably calls me every 2 weeks with her fears about whether she's going to have to move out of her rental facility. It's being sold, the rent's going up, she doesn't know how she's going to pay for it, and that's just a replicated issue over and over again. So there's a few stories at the end that you could go away with. I won't go over each one of them right now, but you know, we got great stories. I mean, if we weren't there, there are a lot of people who would be coming to your police department or going to the emergency room or doing any number of things that I think we head off as a result of being available to our members of our community. So I'm happy to take any questions.
We've got time for about 2 questions. Please? No.
I have a question.
Councilor Ollenberg.
When you're doing these, going back to page number 2, about nearly 25% of that population, 65 and over, you guys factor in income. Can you tell us what the demographics are, income-wise, of all these people coming in?
You know, I can't right offhand.
Okay,
Uh,
next
but I'm-
question.
But
then,
I'm
since
glad,
you-
but I'm glad to
Okay.
research that for you.
I don't want to take up the time that we got to move on, because we don't have an answer for that. I don't mean to cut you off, we're going to move on. But one of the things that jumps out at me on the percentage of increase at ages plus, there's an anomaly here on your page for the graph, percentage increase at age, that jumps 6.5% plus 6.5% in 2015, 2016. What creates that anomaly? There's a fairly steady 2% variation for the previous, like 15 years, but then all of a sudden we get this 2-year period, 15, 16, it jumps at 6%.
I'm gonna have to get back to you on that also. I mean,
Okay.
this is stuff that we are pulling from Economic Development Council,
Okay.
et cetera, so.
Because when I look at jumps like this, it kind of diminishes the validity of the study or the presentation. I had some other questions, but I've used those two.
So would you like to email me with those questions?
Pardon?
Would you like to email me with those questions?
Yes, I could do that. In
Yeah.
fact, I'll talk to you after the meeting. How's that?
Okay, or I'll pass you, since I have to go to another meeting, I'll leave some.
Well,
bits.
let me just, on the congregate meals, yeah, congregate meals looks like it's a push, south end and north end. And then you go into these other meal deliveries and stuff like that, and there's this major offset in there. What creates that anomaly?
You know, you have a higher demand here in the north
But they're
end,
the same, north end, south end, according to the,
but the congregate,
Yeah.
from the congregate are.
define
and
that for me if you would.
Congregate is walking into a lunchroom like at the Oak Harbor Senior
okay.
Center.
Okay.
So where you have a hosted location
Okay.
for it, versus actually delivering the meal to the home.
That's all I have, thanks, Mayor.
Okay. And I'll try to get that back to you.
I think it'd be a good idea to communicate for additional questions, so if you
Yeah.
could leave, I have a couple too, but I think we're going to need to move on.
Okay, okay. I thank you very much for your time and
Thank you
the
for what you
opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Good info.
Thank you, Sharon, for what you do. We appreciate it. Thanks for the presentation.
You're welcome.
Okay, we're going to move on to our second presentation, which I know is scheduled some. I'd like to introduce Ferd Johns. Ferd is a volunteer with the Main Street Oak Harbor program and a retired architect that works more than most full-time workers. We appreciate everything you do, Ferd, and thanks for coming today with your presentation. Turn it over to Ferd.
Thank you, Mayor Shevins, and thank you for having me again. Is it possible to dim the lights a little bit in here so the slides show up a little better? You know, a really good designer told me once, I said, oh man, that's a neat idea, I'm gonna borrow that. He said, don't borrow it, he said, steal it. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, when you borrow something, it still belongs to the person you took it from. When you steal it, you take it and you make it your own. And I understood what he meant by that. He meant, and I'm gonna show a bunch of slides of towns around here in Washington State that are very close to us. And the reason I'm going to show this is not because I think there are better places in Oak Harbor to live, because I could have moved there if I'd wanted to. I'm going to show these because maybe we might want to make some of these ideas our own. There are actually some ideas that the design committee that I'm on of Main Street has discussed, and I went around and took some photographs of examples of those to show, and I didn't take examples in Europe and I didn't take examples on the East Coast, took examples to show what we could do in the state of Washington, because we got some special rules here in the state that make some things impossible to do for us. Let's see. Is the big silver one the one I push?
Right here.
Okay, got it. The challenges and opportunities as we see it for here are that we need to focus new growth downtown as opposed to at the outskirts of Oak Harbor. We need to reconnect with the waterfront. We need to help people actually find the historic downtown, and we have to redefine the retail experience of the downtown, and we do that by making small but important moves. For example, focusing new growth downtown, mixed use, housing over retail, or just plain housing. These are examples from Bellingham, which is a slightly larger place than we are, but we see smaller examples, not maybe so elegant, in other places like Langley here. We see retirement living downtown, apropos of the last thing we were just talking, last presentation we were just talking about. We see a waterfront boutique hotel, which ironically, one of these is right across the street from the retirement home. These are ways to focus things downtown. We have the possibility of locating high traffic public services downtown, like the post office or the library. In order to reconnect with the waterfront, we can do the obvious things. We can build docks and boardwalks, and we can build plazas and overlooks, Citizens Plazas here in La Conner, and Remembrance Plaza in Anacortes, looking out over the water. We can build visitor docks. We can also, at a smaller scale, we can frame views to the water from the downtown area so that you're always aware that you're in a waterfront community. We can, where you can't see, we can landscape and make defined pedestrian ways that lead you down to the waterfront. Doesn't have to be a big wide open view, but it's always nice if you can get one of those worked out. You can look through the park to the water. You can define a pedestrian way across a parking area. We have a lot of areas where that might work in this town. And here's Langley, you know, it's hard to know that there's actually a waterfront there because it's so far down. Well, they did a little walkway down, a little stairway down, and then put a statue there with a dog that draws your attention over there, so you're immediately made aware that it's there. They're small moves, like some of them that are made in Coopville. And events, of course. And celebrate the waterfront. I don't know when the last time that whale bell got rung down in Langley, and it probably really doesn't matter, but when you walk by that, you're aware that we got whales out there and we got waterfront down there. And tell people about it, the fish bench signs that tell us what's going on. In order to find the downtown, this is on the way to Anacortes. Everybody talks about the arch at Anacortes. Don't forget, there's another sign out there that on the highway, which is a pretty big deal. The sign to Fairhaven. And once you have shown them where downtown is, tell them a little bit about it. A lot of public displays talk about downtown. Redefining the retail experience. Use the sidewalks. Light, color, landscape passages, creative signs, inviting passages, human scale and detail. All these are ways that we can encourage people to come to our downtown and to use it more intensively. Preserve and reuse history. I like the one on the right. There's a public toilet right there, right next to a little historical plaza. Everybody needs to go to the bathroom sometime. Windows, shop windows, inviting shop windows. There's some that are better than others, some that make you want to walk up and see what's in there. I really like the one on the left-hand side there. That's a thrift store. Look at that window. That's a thrift store? Yeah. We got some good ones here in town already. But there's a lot more that we could do. Making these small but important moves we talk about. There's secret places. There are some of those buried in a lot of these towns where you just sort of walk around and suddenly you find a little garden back there that you can eat in behind it. Benches and bushes, I call it, you know, and we've also got a very nice information kiosk that signage and plants and scale and celebrate the ordinary. That telephone booth there in Langley. I don't know if anybody uses that, but it's there. Clear branding. La Conner has got that little bike stand with a rainbow bridge embossed in it. And then let's not have so many vacant windows. On this in the doghouse in Langley, they've got all those posters from shows in there. This little shop in La Conner on the left-hand side is way out of scale with the rest of the buildings up and down the street. Doesn't share an architectural heritage, but it's been celebrated in a real special way, and it makes a little special place along the way. So what are the challenges and opportunities again? We want to focus new growth downtown, reconnect with the waterfront, be able to find the historic downtown, and redefine the retail experience and make the small but important moves. So let's take a look at some opportunities we have. We got a lot of opportunities downtown for some of these uses that'll bring people there. And then focusing new growth, we can infill and upgrade underutilized areas. There's that little shopping area that was created down in Langley across the street there. And we have some areas that could use a little bit of upgrading possibly. And how we do it now. This is a very special place. Serendipity Lane. I think that could be worked on a bit. When you get to LaConner, you know you're there because the sign tells you so. On the left-hand slide, I'm driving past the Burger King up from South Island. Where's downtown Oak Harbor? Well, coming from the other way, I should be able to find it. Driving down past the Safeway. Where's downtown Oak Harbor? This building in Anacortes is not any great shakes as a piece of architecture, but they've done some sort of skillful stuff to bring it into scale with the street. So there are a few things we can do that aren't really big deal things. They're just things of being a little bit more careful, and that's one of the things that Main Street is all about. We're trying to upgrade these things and to bring these things back to life to help our town recover. But we're going to need some help. You know, we're going to need some help. We can't do it all. So there are things that possibly we can do together that can make these things happen. Now, the slide on the right-hand side is a little bit subtle maybe. If you look at the slide on the left-hand side, you see they've got angled parking and a sidewalk, and we've got benches and plants. And then you look at the slide on the right-hand side, and there's sort of a difference in feel about that. This is a place in Fairhaven, and it's a pretty simple move, really. There's some places for trees, but then look, all the signs and all of the bike racks are all aligned in there to provide a sort of a protective barrier between the cars, the front of the cars, and the sidewalk. And it makes your focus on what's going on in the buildings next door as opposed to being exposed to the street. Maybe we could use some space we have that we don't typically use, like with our parking, that maybe we could put a tree in it, or maybe at least a planter spot. So how do we get there? There are going to be some big moves, I would suggest, and I know you all know this better than I do. The town dock, the main street in the city of Oak Harbor. We're going to have a redevelopment plan and get permits and grants and maybe a public development authority to get a town dock. That's a long-term thing. Well, we got to start planning sometime. We got to get started on it sometime. It takes a long time to get something like that built. If we think it's a good idea, and I think it's a good idea, I think it's really what sets us apart from places that are inland that don't have the waterfront we've got. I think it's something we could get started on, and I think the rest of Main Street does too. Bayfront site, Main Street in the city of Oak Harbor, could get together and talk about a redevelopment plan, some brochures to try to attract the right developers, some sort of workout, some sort of pro formas to figure out what might make sense on there. And then what I call a list of asks and incentives. We've given away a lot of our incentives because the zoning is very high down there. Nobody's going to need any more zoning than they've already got down there. So we don't really have much negotiating power in that way. So we got to figure out, what can we do? What kind of incentive can we offer a developer to do the kinds of things that the city of Oak Harbor wants done down there, as opposed to what that developer might want to do? Infill sites, Main Street, the same thing. Major renovations and reconstruction sites, same thing. Small moves, plan, design, and implement now. Streetscape, sidewalk furniture, signage and lighting, Main Street, and the city can assist with some of the public areas. Inviting and interesting landscape pedestrian connections to the waterfront, Main Street, and the city again can help there. Public and private plazas, passages, and pocket parks, Main Street, and the city assists with the public. And private signage and window display design assistance, Main Street can do that. So basically, this is how I hope that Main Street will continue to work with the city of Oak Harbor, which has been very supportive in trying to improve our historic downtown. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ferd. Councilor Mons.
Is it possible for your presentation to get to the city so that we could download it on our?
You have it.
We have it?
I can figure out a way to, I'll get it. Yes, I will. Absolutely.
Or get Tim to shoot it to us.
Councilor Shabady.
I just want to say thank you for some of those, like little pocket parks. There's one in Langley, and I think you showed it, and I wandered into that one day. And it was one of those little, very tiny but mesmerizing spaces. What I very much appreciate about this presentation is how well you compared a current snapshot, perspective-wise, the exact same lines basically, but at a different location, and to show how that can be improved. And sometimes creating that change, it's hard to visualize what that could look like. You did an excellent job. You either took a lot of pictures or had a great eye as you looked through Oak Harbor and then went to these other communities, because those line up so well that it's very easy to start to visualize that change, and hopefully we'll be able to affect some of that change. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Yes, Councilor Holmberg.
Thank you, Mayor. Could you go to your very first slide, the intro that you had, and the first item that we had on that? And then we'll come back to this one for just a minute and just take a look at D. Focus on growth in downtown. Okay, think about that for just a minute. That growth you're referring to is people who live there, traffic, you're trying to increase traffic down there?
Now,
What do you mean by growth?
okay, in other words, we got new growth. The question is, are we going to focus it outside of the city limits, or are we going to try to focus downtown? What I would perceive, and I think we would feel is a good idea, is something called heads on pillows. If we can get more people living downtown, if you get more people living downtown, usually the shops improve, the restaurants improve. In other words, the whole place, just by the way the system works, tends to upgrade.
You're preaching to the choir right now, because I've been playing that band for a long time.
Yeah.
Now I'd like for you to go, and because of time, go to the very last one that we were at. Focus on the growth for downtown for just a minute. Now
Sure.
go to the last one. On D, major renovation, reconstruction sites, redevelopment plans, brochures, ask incentives, and performance. What I would like to mention is the city will be getting a request, if they haven't already received it from the planning department. There is a group that wants to do a residential that is for affordable housing and low-income housing down there. They're currently working with a property owner. And I talked to Doug about that briefly the other day. The very first thing that came to me about what is really two things that stand in the way of them doing that is they're still working on their total funding. They have a commitment for the land. The total funding for the project, they're in the process. But the one thing that the city can do is change our ordinance, in this case, so that we don't have mixed use in the building, that we are allowed to have residential at the first floor. Right now, our ordinance prohibits residence at street level.
Right.
The reason that's important is we have a lot of vacancies down there right now, and vacancies with 50 cents a square foot rent for the ones that are rented. I mean, it's cheap. Nobody is going to build a building and have dead space down there. So we as a community, as a council and staff, we have to look at that ordinance and see how we can craft it, not after people start trying to get the project going, but be proactive and do it in advance, because they're moving. They will be coming in here asking, and the next thing I'll be doing is complaining that the city is standing in the way of us trying to provide affordable housing, meet the needs of low income, and get people downtown.
Okay, Rick, that's a really good question, because in the asks and incentive, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. That's one place where we've got something the developer wants, okay? So what is the purpose of saying we want to have retail downtown? It's to have a lively street, right? So if we get some design review of what the street facade of that building, what the street frontage of that building is like, and whether it will add to the life of the city or just be a blank wall or just be, you know, something that's a void with a bunch of small, cheap windows stuck in it. And I think if we can trade that, say, okay, if you'll allow us a little bit of latitude to review this for design, to keep this sense of the street as a lively street, it's probably a good trade.
And there are things that can be done with the first level.
Sure.
Even if we're doing residence at first level, that the architecture in the front of that building can also be in the future, if the market really heats up down there, where it can be converted back to retail.
Right.
Okay.
Of course, the brownstones in New York are some of the coolest
Sure.
things to walk by in the whole of New York City. It's all residential.
Yeah.
It really has to do with design review. I think
Yeah.
that works.
Thank you, that's all I have.
Anyone else? Yes, Councilor Watson.
I appreciated your comment on restrooms. I don't remember where it was in there, but I know we've talked about that. We've had a couple of council meetings where citizens have asked about having some sort of public restrooms, specifically on Pioneer, where we have a lot of festivals and, you know, a lot of events on that street. It's really a great thing. And I know there's some spots. I know we're talking a lot about private land, private buildings, that we're not in certain control of. But it's something that I think is important. And if there's a way, I know we've talked about our Portland loos and different types of restrooms, but I think, and even just, it's not even so much for events, because events you're going to need lots of restrooms. You probably have to bring in lots of portable restrooms. But just for our visitors that come every weekend or walk around, our own citizens that walk around and shop, and it would be nice to have in a high traffic area that is meant to be. I really would like for us to think about that and maybe try and find a specific way, if there's somebody that has a private land, that we could, a spot that we could really push to try and get some sort of partnership with someone to get at least a couple of restrooms somewhere down there visible and on the path that people know that they can use if they're down there. So I appreciate that comment too. It's something I'd like to work on in the future for sure. And I also, you know, and this is just my brain, like I said, a lot of the buildings down there, they're privately owned. They're owned by people, businesses, and the land, a lot, you know. So I really appreciate when someone can tell me, because I'm not real well versed in this, what can we do, like specifically, like Rick said, can we change our ordinance to allow this to happen? If there's things like, what can we do to make our sidewalk look like a garden? What can we do to get a pocket park? Like, I don't know, but I would appreciate knowing, and I would certainly be willing to help in any way and make good decisions about that. But it certainly is important to me to have a real, like, what as a city council and as a city can we do to make this happen on private property, or to make an incentive. We can't control. We put in their windows. Yeah, I can't go knock on someone's door and say, please put pretty posters in your window or plant. You know,
Well, that's really that's really what Main Street does. So that's Main Street's job, and we work hopefully with the city in trying to address all these issues. And you know, I can't change the city ordinance, and I wouldn't dare even suggest it. But I think there are ways to
Good
do
idea.
that, and we like to,
Concrete plans and ideas would certainly be good.
great,
Thank you.
thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, Councilor Hizon.
I have a question, it's probably more for Steve. Mr. Powers, my apologies. I didn't pay attention to what order it was in, but there was a slide that you showed that went down the street where there's public parking, and it's the Mermaid intersection. I don't know what
Dock.
street is that?
That's
Thank
Dock
you,
Street.
Thank you, Dock. And so you've got, the flat naked facade of the building on the right, and then our public parking on the left.
Right.
So I guess this is in line with Erica's, like, how much, that's a privately owned building, so where is our right of way? What can we do about the side of a building, or do we only have any control over the left side where our property is?
Well, typically, our greatest control, of course, is the public realm. So
Right.
the public rights of way from wherever that line is to wherever that line
Right.
is, that's the area that we control. And that's why we made the improvements that we did in the Pioneer Way project, because we controlled that portion of the right of way. We can, as was suggested earlier, through our codes, set the stage for certain kinds of things that take place on the private property. And then I agree with Ferd that some of the things that are different really can be encouraged through Main Street or through other citizen organizations, where maybe we're not quite in a position to say, hey, it'd be great if you painted the side of your building.
Right.
That might be something
Yeah,
that
so
would be perfect for
When it
Main
comes
Street
to
to say.
exterior, what
Right.
is it that
Right.
how far can we go?
So I think we can look at all sorts of creativity and flexibility to build into the code.
Right.
But then we still need somebody to take advantage of that, right? Because we're not the investor, we're not the builder, et cetera. So we can help set the stage, we can do our part in the public realm, wherever that is going to be defined. And then we can hopefully be encouraging of those private efforts that would say, hey, it'd be really great if you did something over there. Yeah.
I think part of the question was, obviously the road runs right up to the edge of the building, and there is no sidewalk on that side, and but I assume that is public property. I haven't gone and run and checked. So I think it would be possible, if the city wanted to do that, to put some sort of landscaping or sidewalk or something down there in the right of way, but it would narrow the roadway. In other words, it would narrow the right of way of the road, so I just
Yeah, there's only so much finite space, right?
Yeah.
And this is the very dilemma that we faced when we did the Pioneer Way project, is that you've got storefront to storefront, and what are the things we're gonna fit into that space?
Yeah, it's already defined, so we have
Yeah,
to work within
but if you think of it as a canvas, you can change what's on that canvas. You just have to make choices about how you choose to use that space.
Councilor Servadius.
Sorry, just dovetailing off that, I think one of the slides you had was of China Harbor, that parking lot at the entrance.
Yes,
And I don't know if it was actually a half parking spot, but it also implied there's a little space there between the sidewalk.
right.
And to think about, I donate my time and my kids' time. It could be a community effort where you go down there and you talk to them if they wanted to, and you actually cut out a chunk of asphalt and you put some little just pocket garden in that half parking spot.
Sure.
I just appreciate the vision with those pictures to help hopefully facilitate some of that change. So I happen to dig some holes. Help sign me up.
I was
Councilor
threatened
Olberg.
with death if I
Thank you,
went
Mayor.
over 30 minutes, am I?
Well, we're
To
set to go at 3 for the next
To
presentation.
emphasize what Mr. Powers is saying, when we went through this Pioneer Way, the restrictions that we encountered were a lot of geometric.
Right.
We have horizontal, vertical elevations and dimensions that we are worked in with this envelope, and it was hard to get in what we did down there even right
Sure.
now. It doesn't preclude us from trying to improve other areas.
Right.
But it was the geometry that was really overridden by a lot of emotion.
Sure.
And you guys understand that because you have to build within those parameters.
It's true, thanks.
So we've still got a minute or two if you want. Anyone else? Councilor Servadius?
I'm just intrigued by those pictures. Bike rack step. Now, what do we have? Because I know my kids ride down. Popsies is the mainstay. They love riding down there. Do we have bike racks downtown?
Not many. We have a few.
There's one of those simple changes that
Right.
cut out a little square, put one
Yeah.
in. Just
Some of those sexy ones, you know, that are designed.
Looks like a bike. Thank you.
Yes, Councilor Hizon.
I have another, on that note, in terms of installing anything on the sidewalk, or I think there's a suggestion of them, chopping up some asphalt to put something in there. I mean, how much are we really gonna break up and or dig on Pioneer Way? I have a hard time believing that. I think we would be reticent to break ground on Pioneer Way for any reason. So maybe there's somebody who can answer this, but in terms of installing something like, I mean, we have potted plants and stuff, but how much breaking up of concrete and asphalt does something like installing a bike rack take? Because that's a concern. So anything we need to do would probably have to take place above ground exclusively or minimal.
Most of the things that I would envision would be minimal, but on the other hand, there are places where it would be reasonable to do that with the proper procedures and the proper care. I understand where you're coming from. Yes.
You have a twinkle in your eye. I know you know where I'm going.
Okay.
Thank you
Thank
very much.
Yes, we appreciate that presentation from Main Street. So we are now going to move along to a presentation from administration. And it looks like this will be Dr. Merriman. Okay.
And Nicole and I were doing the iMessage across the room, and she'll be getting a copy of that last handout and emailing that out to everybody. So she'll be seeing that in your email here probably shortly after the meeting too.
Did you mean birds? You said that, yeah, okay.
Okay, this next item on our agenda is our legislative priorities. This is our annual process for looking at and reviewing our list that we want to take down to Olympia this year. And in the packet that Nicole has put together for you, there are a couple different items. I'll just point out what those are. The first one on the left, you'll see the gold banner across the top of 2018. This is a printout of AWC's legislative priorities that they've put together for 2018. On the right side of your packet, we have 3 different items, I believe. The very top one are the ones that Mayor Severance has put together and prioritized for those that could be potential ones for 2018 for us. As you can see, some of these are very familiar. We have low impact development, which we've talked about quite a bit. The Marina, Main Street, wastewater treatment plant, Highway 20, Capron transportation funding, Boys and Girls Club, liquor, marijuana, and Deception Pass Bridge. These are the top 10 here, and we've expanded out some of the language on these. Remember last year how before that we used to just have the title. We're trying to put more of a statement on there and use those action verbs that we'd like to see on there to encourage some activity on those. The next item you'll see on the top, it says staff recommendations and edits. And these are looking at some of the top 10 that we've had in the past, some comments from staff as far as different things we see on those. On the second page of that, you'll see the supported issues platform. These are those items that we don't have a specific action that we're looking to get from our legislators, but if they're in legislative session and they start hearing these things being talked about, we want to make sure they're aware of those, that these are of interest to us, and for them, if they hear those topics come up, that they take some action on that, or they let us know so we can help them put together a position statement on where the city might stand on those items. At the very bottom of that page, just looking it over, we had a couple of items we weren't quite sure on. One was we did last year have the Oak Harbor School District and the anticipated growth. We just wanted to see how we wanted to word that one, if that was still applicable or what we wanted to do. And then we have a potential addition, and this is the cellular communications. and the small cell deployment. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes after this discussion. But there's some new things in that technology area that'll be coming up that we may want some assistance on. And then finally, we have this last item on this right side. It says current status and staff efforts. And what we've done is went down for each of these items we've had in the past. Some of them we did some work on. We went down and testified in Olympia. We've written materials for our legislative delegation. So we went down for each of these that we've had in the past to show what some of the actions we've taken, or if it hasn't been on the city side and staff involvement with that, some that our legislators and our Senate office has taken. So it gives you a little bit of an update on where those items are. It was actually a good idea, I think, to not just have that list and then it dies at the end of the year, but we do want to show that we're taking some steps on that, or our legislative and Senate team is doing that as well. So this is a lot of different information, but the key takeaway that we want to do is start putting together that list to hand off this year. And so these are all different things that you can look at. You may have some that you may want to add as well, but this is really just an open discussion on how you would like to proceed and how staff can help you put this together for the 2018 session.
Councilor Weiser.
Have you had a chance to meet with the school district, with Dr. Gibbon or anyone, to see if they have some big priority that maybe they're pushing for, that maybe we could, partner with them? Or I know we've done that in the past. It's on here from last year. I think we did that. And I just briefly, I had a meeting, OHEF meeting at the school district last week, and in passing, I mentioned to Dr. Gibbon that we were going to be in the process of working on our legislative priorities, and I asked him if he, if there were some big issues, and it was just real quick, and he said, yes, but let's make a meeting and talk about it, so maybe there is something going on that maybe we should know about, or at least, have some sort of talking points, or know what they're doing.
I meet with Dr. Gibbon monthly. We had a meeting 2 days ago.
Oh, good.
We didn't discuss legislative priorities, but we certainly discuss, issues that are going on, or things that we do together. I'd be happy to reach out to him, and I think it'd be easy to do. We've got a dialogue going about some other things right now, so
It's important.
yes, certainly.
Know what's going on,
always.
at least when we get there, and when we're talking to people, and what their issues are, and it affects all of us, so it's important.
Yeah, and that is a big part of our community,
Oh,
very
yeah,
important
for
part,
sure.
and I certainly agree.
Even if it's not on here, at least to know.
There's a part of me that wonders if 10 is too many.
Yeah.
When you meet, I think we've had we've had some communications with our legislators recently that have been, I think, more directly related to a particular area, and it feels good to do that, be able to do it that way, to communicate. If we decide that LID is still our number one this year, and it may not be. I'd certainly love to hear input today if you feel like priorities need to be moved around, because I didn't work a lot on the priority part of it. I just was trying to get down to less issues, or what I felt were the most important issues. So I'd really like your input about the priorities, and then I think we've had some pretty effective results recently, and can get our legislators working hard for us in a particular or several of these particular areas. So I'm looking for input. Yes, Dr. Merriman.
Just one thing, the last couple of years, one thing we've done is started at this point. What we're doing right now is casting the net. So we're trying to catch all those items that might be potential topics, and then want to pull those together and get those consolidated. And then probably what we would do is similar to the last 2 years, we've taken maybe the top 5 and put them on that front cover sheet. And on the back, we've put in the remaining ones that we've had. And it seems like that has worked really well. It's actually, I've seen our legislative and Senate staff, their eyes light up because it's like they have something focused rather than walking in with a list of 20 items. I think the mayor is correct. It's been a lot more effective, and we've been able to channel that energy into a couple of different items. And I think that I would suggest maybe we try to aim to that again, just based on that success.
Councilor Munns.
If you look at AWC, they've gone to kind of grouping some, but there's just 4. It's going to be a short session. After going into, what was it, July, they're expecting only 60 days and not a lot to get through, but the bullet works great. I like all 10, but somehow maybe have top 5, but then have the others. 60 days and what are the top 5, but yet if an occasion comes, they also have the other one too. I mean, it's hard to narrow it down to top 5 because sometimes it's a moving, what they decide is important all of a sudden that voters aren't going to vote against them. Some of that is that too, without losing our ethics on what we think is important for our community. But sometimes you've got to go
What's
for
right now.
where you can get them to zero in on. The bullet form we've done, I think, is good too. Fortunately, we see our legislators quite a bit, so it's not like it's a complete surprise. But if their staff were to pass it to other legislators around us, you would like that. So shorter is better, especially when it's only 60 days, but yet it doesn't hurt to have this is good in here too. I mean,
Yeah,
I think it's just how you package it, but I think the top page ought to be maybe a little bit shorter. It's not really long, but let's say, they're probably looking at, okay, 60, what are the 5 big things I can do, or 6, I mean, or the top 3. I mean, it's hard to do that, but it's all on what they pick up first eyesight. What do you see? Do you see a really long drawn out thing, or do you see kind of a short? It's just an eye thing, and you've got to decide what you want your attention. They don't want to feel overwhelmed. They get a lot of support from us, but they also really care about Oak Harbor, and we are the largest city on the island, so there's got to be more emphasis into this population. So I don't know if it really helped you at all, but
I think that speaks to what Dr. Merriman was headed towards.
Right.
Kind of like we did last year, top 5 on the front page. I'd be interested in your feelings about what you feel the top 5 are. You don't have to tell me that today,
Right.
but I'd sure appreciate your input about what you feel the top 5 are. Councilor Westman?
So I know this kind of goes along with low impact development, but I think, and we've all heard this and we all know this, that housing, affordable housing, low income housing, housing across the board is important to us, and we're in a situation where it's desperately needed. But that's not really like out there anywhere on here. I mean, I know it maybe is kind of implied in the low impact development, but maybe if there was a creative way, just so that they're aware that that's maybe a priority for us, is to, and again, like I said with this, it's like, what are some specific things that can be done to, to help us. I know it's on the AWC, but it's in our community. For us, that is something that's, that we need to address and need some, and I'm not the expert, but maybe there's a way to tie that in with the low impact development somehow, or make that that would be an important one to me. I did have a question, and also the marina, because I think that maybe is a pressing issue. I think what Councilmember Munns is saying is what is critical, like in this session, that could be either given or taken away or changed, or what are they going through in this session that maybe that needs to drive our top 5. And I know the marina is on a time crunch, right? So that maybe to me would be an important one. And then I had a question on and this is for Dr. Merriman, on the wastewater treatment plant funding sources. How are we in that process? Like, I know a lot of it has been secured. You've been through it with us in the past. It's been a while though. But what is left? Like, is there still a lot of funding sources that we haven't secured that are coming up that we could? Is that something that is very important to us in your opinion, or?
It still is in some ways. We've got, although we have the majority of it done, kind of the new twist to this on the wastewater treatment plant is getting the capital budget passed, which still hasn't been done yet. So it might be before where it was the acquisition of funding and getting that. Now it's, okay, now that we've gotten on the list, we've had that, help us through whatever means or whatever processes have to occur to get that officially passed. Because we've had some discussions that we may still get the SRF money if certain things are allowed to be. But also in that capital budget is the .09 money, economic development money, which is locked up in that. And we had, I think, about a $2.5 million grant direct request to the legislature for the wastewater treatment plant. So even though we've got those applications in and we haven't identified, we still haven't gotten it signed on paper yet. And that's some of the stuff we need their help on.
That's what the priority is.
Correct.
So, okay.
Councilor Holmberg?
Thank you, Mayor. You know, the meetings that we've had, AWC, that they've been lobbying for the marijuana revenues for law enforcement, et cetera, and also for the Public Works Trust Fund. If they're lobbying for those things, why are we cluttering up our list with things that they're already focused on? And I'd also say, even as important as Deception Pass Bridge is, if something happened on Deception Pass Bridge, there would be so much action on that, about the same as when the bridge went down on the Skagit River. You know, in 30 days they had it fixed. So what is it specifically that we are talking about that we want the legislature to focus on relative to Deception Pass Bridge? We all know it's important. The military knows it's important. State Highway knows it's important. So why don't we focus on things that reduce our exposure, and the highest exposure that we have for local citizens in terms of creating affordable housing is that LID stormwater package that has such a huge impact per household.
We just need to make that vocal as part of that, you know, this is why.
That's good input. Appreciate that.
The Capron
Yes,
too, I think that's very important to us, that maybe like a bigger group like the AWC might not know about or take a hard look at, but for us, I think that is one. I mean, we can't risk, we just had our presentation, you know, from Kathy about our streets funds and funding, and we can't, I mean, that's very important to us as far as our streets, so I would suggest that that be a priority too.
Councilor Survey?
Yeah, I think I'll echo probably what Mr. Holmberg said. You know, we could probably get the top 3 or 5, but some of these, liquor and marijuana, AWC will continue to negotiate for those, so we could list that on the back. But find probably our top 3, which are probably LID, the Marine Equity, wastewater treatment plant. I think that's going to, unless we go for one more round of funding,
Yeah.
I think that will sort itself out. So we could probably get down to the top 3, and then AWC is going to continue. I really appreciate, this is the most text I think I've seen on some of their pieces. They're usually really graphical. I always like when they do the support or oppose on different bills, and there's a couple on the back here, House bills, that specifically address the liquor, the marijuana, and specifically one that's of interest to me, the 1% property tax cap. Just trying to keep pace with inflation. I think we could make mention of some of those that would very much benefit us locally, and let the more global ones sort themselves out.
Councilor Hizon?
I agree that with the sentiment that we need to prioritize the issues that have the largest and most significant impact in our community. And you know, while all of these are relevant, this list I definitely needs to be prioritized. I mean, liquor taxes and marijuana revenue are at the bottom. I mean, that's massive, important funding. One of the things that I do like about what AWC did, and I think what Beth mentioned, is to have an issue and then have bullets under that issue, because something like liquor tax and marijuana revenue, that could just be restore revenue, bullet, as opposed to having those, you know, two separate paragraphs. And I don't know if we could do the same thing by combining the, you know, Cape Ron Public Works and highway funds. I mean, whatever is the most closely aligned, I think that we could group those, and not in an attempt to add more, you know, put giant paragraphs on here, but just a real general, you know, restore funding, blah, 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 example A and B. And so we wouldn't have to whittle down quite so much, but we could still present less words. I do have a question about the Boys and Girls Club facility funding. How can the state work toward that? What role would the state have in funding a Boys and Girls Club facility?
Well, you could probably answer it better than me.
Part of the program that the Boys and Girls Club is trying to do is they have gone to our legislative team and asked for $1 million to see if they can get some form of grant to assist them in building their new offices there. They've had those discussions. There's been some back and forth as far as some deliverables that the legislative team wants to see them develop, and that is their program fundraising and some different things like that. So, in fact, I believe tonight they're even having a brainstorming meeting on that at the Senior Center at 6:30 for those that want to go. So I think the legislative tie to that is that grant request, and for them to see once they maybe get through some of these benchmarks they've been assigned, that the legislators would then feel comfortable going forward to see if there's some legislative assistance they can get for funding.
So we could, Boys and Girls Club facility funding, or Carver School District, maybe throw Main Street in there in terms of
Outside
support for
organizations.
these community missions, organizations, projects, etc., with a list of those things instead of, again, instead of the same massive.
If I could add just a little bit on the Main Street funding one, that one is getting to be a little more urgent than it was in the past, and there's a set dollar amount of money the legislature sets aside for the Main Street program. And then we have that New Year, I was looking for Patricia, the New Year's Eve thing where we have to be on the computer at 1 minute after midnight because it's a race of all cities to try to get in there and get a piece of that fixed dollar amount. We're probably twice as many cities now that there used to be going after Main Street funding. So that pot is getting divided into thinner slices. So that one is going to be pretty critical for the Main Street program because they're wanting to see if the legislature will double or at least to some degree increase that pot of money that's available for more cities to be part of. We just saw the presentation on that, and that's their primary funding source that we participate with them on. So.
Councilor Munn?
I would be a little worried trying to put Cape Ron transportation funding grouped with public trust because there's so few. It's just the island, us and San Juan's, that can get that. And if we don't make that a separate, I don't want it to get lost in the shuffle on that. The other one is we need to be able to give a story, a short story, like how much is the cost of the municipal courts? We fought it on having that the municipal court judges are kind of picked by us, but if all the judges had to go in an election, then that is extra money for us to fund for those races and all this kind of stuff. So there are some of the stuff that we need to be able to say, dollar-wise, this is what's helping the cities, because sometimes the big cities get in there, the big five, and we get lost in the shuffle. So it's good to group, but also think about the Cape Ron funds. I think are just too important. I'd hate to see that group with public. Yes, they're related, but let's not have it get lost in the shuffle, because there's only, what, 7 cities or 7 areas that really goes towards. I just don't want to see that watered down kind of thing. But be able to tell stories about the court. Legislators are finally getting it where they have to pay money for the public record thing, so that's become a little higher priority for them. They got a little bit of legislation for that. The cellular communications, boy, there was a huge push, and Oak Harbor needs to be sure to have her voice said that the big companies came in and said, no, we can tell the cities what's best, and we don't want them to tell us what design we have to have, and we don't want them to tell us how much we can charge, and they got very close to getting that through. And it's important for how our city looks, what we really want, what our citizens need. We see that as a way of an economic boom to open up people to work from their homes by getting the fiber, but not to have the companies tell us, and then we'll decide when we're going to bring it to your city. I mean, so you've got, and AWC, when I called them on it, didn't realize that we were part of that group, the conglomerate with the attorney, to help us fix that. And I know our codes are starting to come up, and we'll be voting on that. But you need to have a story. If they'll say why, we need to be able to say, at least one of us, you've got the cell tower story, you've got Cape Ron Fund story, you've got to have a short 2-minute commercial saying, this is important because X amount of dollars, and we've got to, you can't take it away. Because if they don't have the stories to reinforce legislatures, it kind of goes 2 ways. They do stories, we do stories. If only they do stories, then it falls down. So kind of a mix and match.
Anyone else? Yes, Councilor Hizon.
Sorry, I'm making a note, and I'll forget if I don't write it down. Okay. The list, thank you oh so much. The current status list. I'm really interested, not just in hearing about what the city and its staff and what you guys are staying on top of and advocating for, which is fantastic. I appreciate the status. What I'm really interested in is what have our representatives done about this? These bills that have been introduced, did any of our representatives introduce these bills? If it passed, how did they vote? Did they vote yes or no? I mean, I can go in and look up some of that, but it's hard to individually track, if that makes sense. So I wish the AWC would do this, is put out a report card on how representatives did in terms of AWC's priorities. I would really, because if we don't, see, I've looked for one. I've looked for one. Because if, I mean, again, I said this last year, if we give them this list time and time again, and they don't support it, or, I mean, and I know last year we put stronger action language on there versus be okay with this. If there's no action year after year, it'd be nice to say, okay, but you know, you smiled and nodded when we gave you this list and nothing has happened. And that's, in terms of putting a face on human impact of things, that's just an important piece of information for me to know as a side. And I would be interested to know, Beth, you had a great point about the Cape Ron funds. And my worry is that if we take the AWC's priorities and just let them deal with those, that it will give the impression that these aren't important to Oak Harbor. I mean, some of this housing, etc., that should be obvious, or we assume it's obvious, but if we don't specifically mention it, are they going to know it's important to us? So I'm not sure what the perception would be there. I don't want to overload them, but I don't want them to say, "Oh, well, we didn't know that was important to you too." So how do we encompass all of that in what we're doing?
You know, I can answer a little bit of our representatives' actions, but I can't answer a majority of what you're looking at under the current status.
Well, in the bills that are specifically mentioned, I can go and look those up.
Yeah.
The ones that haven't had action, I want to know.
But I think that's
why.
a great, great input that, you know, if we didn't get, you know, the Marine is a great example. We for a couple of years, you know, have been going the legislative route, and it doesn't get wings. Yeah, you know, it doesn't get wings because we're kind of small in the big picture. So that's, you know, a different, kind of going a little bit different direction there, and it's too early to tell, but we're working on some things on that. On the Main Street, I think there are several other communities that are working on, you know, a different fix to how that's done. I don't think we'll have to stay up past midnight on New Year's, but I'm not 100% positive yet, but it doesn't sound like we will. Not that, you know, I have to go to bed before midnight, but anyway, we certainly have the last few years stayed up, and especially last year was at 2 o'clock in the morning, I think, before we finally got funding in there, and almost lost that. So hopefully they'll work to change that. I'm hearing loud and clear. I think Councilor Weiser has a great point that we do need to say affordable housing, and we do need to probably include that either with our low impact conversation. But I think we need to say that. I think we still certainly have an issue here, and it's statewide from the sounds of it, but I believe it's potentially more important in Oak Harbor than a lot of the other areas. So I think we need to say that for sure. I would like to, I think we do need to try to study this a little bit more carefully about what has worked, what did work, or what kind of progress they made. I think that's a great question.
I mean, not just to hold them accountable, but to fall all over ourselves when something happens.
Mhm.
I mean, that's important.
I think we can look into that and try to get some more information on that for you.
Thank you.
Councilor Servades.
Just a quick sidebar, under something that caught my eye, the current status, and maybe this is Kathy, I'll put you on the spot. There's a little story in here about what it takes to keep the lights on for the street lights. This is $184,000 a year.
Yes.
So in my house, I think like a 4-to-1 reduction when you go from incandescent to LED. So before the Amoresco grant and that conversion, was this number, what was that number?
That is the number we're still paying back. Remember, we essentially borrowed the money to do the changeover, and the utility savings, the energy savings, are paying that loan back for a period of time.
So at the 8-ish year mark, or whatever that was, then this number comes down?
Yes,
Okay.
hopefully.
Councilor Allenberg.
Thank you, Mayor. You know, Councilmember Munn's mentioned about having a narrative to tell the story. I think I understood it that way. You know, we pick out some of these bullet points because that's all they really are on the front. They don't have they have meaning, but not a lot of meaning by themselves. Shouldn't we have a narrative in more detail about what it is we want? We kind of encapsulate that in the front. How we can get there to do this with their help, and what we are willing to do to help us get there. I think we have to have skin in the game in a lot of these things that help us get there. Or like in the Capron funds, why is the Capron fund so important to this community? Why is low impact development modifications important? Not to delete the need for low impact development, but how to apply it in this area, and what the consequence is if we don't have an alternative in terms of housing. That story doesn't get told in these little PowerPoints.
You know, I think along that line, it would seem to me like we would want to definitely try to go down to five issues.
And have backup pages that show if they want more detail about each of those,
Sure.
what is the consequence.
And maybe, you know, and we kind of did this last year, or we tried to. We may have, if you study the way we presented it last year, our first page was 5. I think we had 5 issues, and we thought we felt that was our most important issues. But I think what I'm hearing you say is maybe the bullet point is not low impact development. What we need is relief under low impact. We have a different story, we believe, with less rainfall, or you know, our story could be different. And I think that's what you're saying is that
put our story in writing, so it's not just a conversation over the table.
yeah.
That's a really good point, because when Ferd was doing the presentation, I'm watching it and I'm thinking, those are really pretty pictures, but what exactly is it that we
How do
can
you get there? Yeah.
Exactly. What exactly is it that we can do to help get there? So our legislators are probably thinking the same thing when we say we want all these pretty things.
Yes, Councilor Munns.
In all the meetings we've had, and we kept hearing, well, it's more expensive to build in the city than it is in the county. What are the restrictions that, if there was some tweaking to them, and I don't think we have hit home enough on, we may be considered a big medium city, but we're actually rural because of the annual income of our citizens in the city and in the county. Instead of being 52,000, it's only 32,000. So that puts us at a huge difference in affordability of clothes and housing and food and all of that, because we're already $20,000 less as far as, you know, incomes per average income per. But what is it that is causing it to be such a huge difference? Part of it is the LID stuff, because they have us in Olympia rainfall and not our local, you know, but I meant some of that stuff. If, yes, we are 22,000, but if this were to be changed, or this and this would drop, and to make it easier for who we have living here and whatever to have more affordable housing. I don't know, am I not making sense?
No, I know what you're saying.
What he is saying, but there are some little tidbits that go along with that we could put in there that isn't always known, or we haven't said it enough that people know it. And I think our legislators were all terribly surprised the first time you had brought up the study that you had done to verify that, on why we got some of the SRF loans, yet we're 22,000 and we should not have been able to be qualified for them, but because of the income of the community. So sometimes being sure to tell our story and why this is important.
Okay. Yes, Councilor Hizon.
So in the interest of shortening this list, I would like to see us add mental health and substance abuse treatment and senior services. Again, how we bundle that, I would really like to know what we can bundle. In general, you know, Beth had a great point about separating the Capron funds out. So which one of these would work in terms of a bundle? And you know, it might not be a big ask if we put certain things under the heading of community organizations, you know, Boys and Girls Club, senior services, and just ask them to maybe fund based on you know, percentage of over 65 population, as opposed to general population, because that's not equitable. So I'm not trying to complicate this. There's just so much that we need. And it'd be great if we could get some champions out there. I'm not sure how to condense it, though. Other than the grouping certain ones, do you have any feedback on which of these items could be combined?
I'd have to go back and take a look at that and see if we can consolidate a couple of them. So we can look at that and see. The thing we want to do is just make sure we're really specific with our legislative
Right.
team.
Right.
So we give them that specificity to know how to move forward with it. So.
Yes, Councilmember.
Do we have a number from the police chief on how far behind we are in getting our new people into training? Because that's becoming a critical issue across the state. But to be able to say, just here in Oak Harbor, we could have X amount that we know we have funding for to get them onto the street if there were just an academy that had enough classes. You know, they keep saying, oh, well, we can cut money by doing this and this, but then what are they really doing for the safety of the whole state? So do we have some numbers to be able to, like, put on a little side note that we could have X amount? Because I think that, I've heard that's the holdup for a lot of cities, is they've actually gotten through the hiring, but they can't get them through the academy for a year or something. I mean, it's really gotten very drastic as far as that. I mean, that's a good need for our city. That's maybe not crisis yet, but it could be.
On that one, if you take the one packet that is the current status and staff efforts.
Sorry, I didn't get.
Oh, that's right, there's a lot of stuff in there.
Okay.
Go to the very last page, the very last item. And what we ran into, and your point about scheduling and getting people in, that's a good one there. I don't know that we have numbers on that one. What was more the immediate concern was last year, the state was looking at cutting for the classes down there. And that might be what you're talking a little bit there. There was also a shift that they were looking at putting 100% of the cost of the academy training on cities, where that was, I won't say subsidized, but the state cost shared in that program before. And that effort was not successful last year. So there, you kind of have two moving pieces there. One's the funding, and then one is making sure they have enough classes in there. I don't know right now, just based on our turnover rate and those that we're running through the academy, that it's an issue for us, but tomorrow can change. And you never know what we might look at and how many people we may have to be sending down there.
And I can tell you that it is a challenge for us, but it's not a real problem yet. I mean, the challenge is, initially, we had a challenge finding people. And I think, I'm not gonna say we have that solved, but it's gotten better, so that we have, when we're trying to fill an officer position, we do have more options today. So that's gotten better for us here, even though we're isolated, our location is. Then scheduling them for the academy is a challenge, but yet we're not experiencing that as being something that has created vacant positions. So, this sounds like other cities may have more of a challenge that way than we do, so.
Some of the large cities, I mean, they have 20 waiting to get into a class. They could have them, and
Yeah.
it becomes more of a dire situation there. But if we have one that needs to be trained, and since that one could be like 20 officers, I mean, we're not a gigantic force. And
That's right.
That one personnel could feel like it's the 20 we don't have that we need. So I'm just trying to, anyway, and when I get asked on the board, we'll have a meeting December 8th to finalize for AWC, but any stories I can give them from our size city helps reinforce how they're also going to do. They won't lose our list, and they like to have our list whenever we get it done, so they can flip through the different lobbyists so that they know, and then they'll pick up a phone and call me or call you, or, you know, call someone to say, hey, can you get down here, or could you resend us another story? MRSC, getting our staff to say how many times they use it. I've gotten some of the staff to get information. So just the more we can pull it together.
Well, I think the main thing that we'll do, I believe we have this scheduled for a council meeting to actually take action on this. It may be our December 5th meeting.
Is it?
Which one? 21st is the next one. 19th, okay. So we're pushing that to the second meeting in December. So in that meantime, what we can do is look at prioritizing. I jotted down 5 that I heard you all talk the most about. We had affordable housing, we had low impact development, the marina, Main Street, Capron were the one that I have the most tick marks by. And then we have things like the mental health and substance abuse and some other items there. So I'm not asking you to tell me which ones you want on that type 5, but does that sound just basically the direction we want to go? And we can start preparing that information for that council meeting for you to look at. Okay.
My top 5, well, actually, could we combine the Deception Pass Bridge with the State Route 20, or is the realignment completely different thing? And that's Highway 20, so.
Yeah, they both touch Highway 20, but maybe what we can look at is enhanced transportation to and from the island or something like that.
go.
And under
There we
that,
go.
we have 2
Both.
different projects,
Boom.
maybe 2 bullet points.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I've done that, the 20 in Deception Pass Bridge, Cape Ron funding, treatment plant, marinas, and not the low impact development is a separate one, but you know, any kind of relief for the affordable housing thing, which would take the form of bam.
Mhm.
Those would be my 5. And just generally stop burdening cities to balance their budget, multiple exclamation points. There's lots of other ways to do it instead of sticking us with the price tag.
Yes,
On
Councilor
the,
Westman.
on the realignment for 20, that was just mentioned, on your little notes on the red, it says engineering does not foresee the need to relocate our water transition main, like at all, or what? I don't, maybe you gave us an update and I don't know what the status is
I
of
think
that.
we've talked about it a little bit, and I think this is, are we talking about the roundabout down at Sharp's Corner?
Yeah, it says State
Yeah.
Route 20 realignment funds support the
Yeah.
cost of moving the water infrastructure.
No, I don't want to surprise engineering with this, but I think the thing that we've talked about is where the footprint of that roundabout would go.
Mm-hmm.
It's looking like it's lining up in such a way that it would be minimal impact to our water line. So,
Good.
Oh, so could we do that?
Councilor Munch?
It may be a question more for Joe Stowell. So Gibraltar and Miller, they were gonna put a roundabout in there, it's just up the lane. And I didn't know if we would escape the water line there, but I guess there'd been enough accidents, that was one of the deal, that once they got this roundabout, they would also do one. It's kind of an elbow bend, but Gibraltar's on one side and then Miller's a little, and they talked about it, we were gonna be hit double, that one and this one for the water line. Do you know about that roundabout?
It's all part of the same project.
Oh, is it?
And they're likely to build that one first,
Okay.
and then build the one at Sharp's Corner. At least that's what I've heard at this point. And we've seen the plans. We've looked at our alignment compared to what they're proposing. They made some minor storm drainage adjustments, and I think other than raising some valve cans, I think we're in the clear.
Way to go, engineering.
Just a little bit of coordination. It worked well this time.
Take
And
the
the
credit,
Ouija
take
board,
the credit
right?
when you
Ouija
can, man.
board.
So would it be fair to say that we could probably even drop that off this? Yeah,
That's,
at
yeah.
this
Okay.
point, okay.
works on the bridge then.
Anyone else? Okay, well, we've got some direction. We will move back to our 3:45 agenda item that falls under Development Services, it looks like. Mr. Powers, are you, and Mr. Stoll? This is small cell site deployment. You might have to explain to some of these folks, including myself, what that really means.
Actually, this will be a tag team presentation. Joe Stowell obviously will help with this, and actually he's going to lead us off. He's going to talk some about the technology, which is sort of behind this particular topic. And once he gets through that, then I'll give you some briefing on where we think this will take us from a code perspective. What are the implications to our regulations and how we respond to these various companies? So, Joe.
So this reminds me of my best friend. His quote is, "Engineers aren't boring people. We just get excited about boring things." But this is one of those, this is one of those technology things that I really, I find fascinating. I think knowing a little bit about the history of it and leading up to now will help understand why it's important for the city. So this was, 1G, analog, cell phones. This gentleman here, that's the guy, Martin Cooper with Motorola, who making the very first phone call on a mobile phone, calling his competitor, Joe Engel from Bell Systems, telling him, "Hey, we solved the problem." Yeah, it's kind of funny how that goes, but they moved on over some time to in the 90s. It switched to digital, and if you, I remember.
Color faceplate.
Yeah, I know, it's so funny. But it went from, if you remember, it went from analog to digital, and in that step, I remember the call quality going down, and actually the distance to a cell tower was shorter. But what they were able to do with that is squeeze more people onto the same antenna by going digital, just like they did with a high definition television, by getting rid of the analog signals. So then we moved on to the first iPhone, and this was the 3G was huge, So in the 2000s we're still digital, and we stay that way from here on out. We got increased data speeds. Now we're actually starting to be able to start surfing the internet on our phones, and as we all know, it just kind of blossomed from there into 4G, which, yet another increase in speed, and there's been multiple iterations of 4G, believe it or not. You've heard of LTE, that's kind of an increase in speed. So more and more people, we're seeing the data usage go up exponentially as people get more and more smartphones and use it for more and more things. And it starts relaying into other items like they're installing them in cars and then directly into your computer and things like that. So 5G is just a really crazy step. It takes the internet wirelessly and puts it in just about everything. And they call it the Internet of Things, and it allows your refrigerator to talk to your thermostat and whatever else you need it to do. But the speeds go up again in a crazy fashion. The theoretical limit is 20 gigabits per second. We have a lot of talk about fiber and getting 1 gigabit per second homes. 5G has a theoretical, of course it's probably not what it's really going to hit, but the theoretical limit of 20 gigabits per second. Problem is, the signal doesn't travel very far. It doesn't like to go through objects, so it needs line of sight a lot more. What does that mean to us? So here we have the flagpole behind Country Store, and it has a range to it, and that it's doing great right now, 4G. So as the data increases and before 5G kicks in, you'll see your phone start slowing down because there's so many people trying to access that antenna. So what they're wanting to do is add a bunch of smaller cell sites that are still 4G that take some of the load off the big antenna, and they'll talk back to it. That'll still be the brain, but they'll be spread around in places that it's needed, like heavily populated areas. They do this right now, like in stadiums and things like that, where you have a concentration of people and phone usage. So what this will ultimately do is they'll take the same thing, and when it comes time for 5G, they'll be placing these similar antennas on these sites they've already established, and they'll put them at a density that's much greater because the distance that the signal travels is lower. And the distance, and I've heard different stories, but the distance between antennas can be as short as 500 to 1,000 feet. So what they're looking at is how can we put these on top of existing infrastructure? So this is a real gross example of how that's done, but it is a small cell site. So you have an antenna on top with fibers connecting it down to a radio box, and it ties into power. There's a fiber line hanging on the pole that ties it back to the main tower. So it's really crude explanation, but they try to cram it all onto the one pole. And the components don't have to be all that big, and in this case they happen to paint them to match the pole, which is a wooden pole. So there's other ways of doing it. This is an example that we've seen where they put the antenna on top of a light pole, and the brains are in the base. So, and then the communications would come in underground, and it's kind of condensed. There's another one that's another proposal, similar idea, except for you'll notice a subtle difference. The brains are outside the pole. They're on the pedestal next to it. This one again is another example that's a proposal for Seattle. You can see the aquarium flag on there. But it can be decorative. It doesn't have to be out of line. And this is, you might think of something like that downtown. What we want to, and this is something we can consider, but we've kind of thought, because it needs line of sight, one of the proposals is let's put it up really high. We get it out of the view, out of the restrictions of the trees, go over the treetops, and then we can cover a greater area. We put fewer of them in. But you have to go fairly tall to do that. And this is a proposal that was in Texas for one of those. I think it's a mock-up graphic, but you get the idea. And now,
The really exciting stuff.
you thought I was excited.
Obviously, this is not an academic conversation. There's something that is spurring this along. There's a reason why we're talking to you this afternoon about it. And as you saw from the really brief summary statement, what we're responding to is a push out there from some of the carriers who started talking to cities in Washington, particularly in Western Washington, about wanting to hurry up and get these things into the public right away. We've got to hurry and do this. Hurry, hurry, hurry. And I think this is some of what you were talking to, Mrs. Muntz. And sort of condensing the story a little bit, the city's response to that was to band together and form a consortium that really looked at what's the best way for cities to meet their obligations to help facilitate these kinds of cellular communications. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, yet still protect their rights to sort of govern their own community. We joined that consortium shortly after it had been formed, and I think the consensus on the staff is that it was a wise investment on the city's part to participate in that, because it gave us access to subject matter experts, particularly in the legal field, who have quite a bit of experience working with franchise agreements and negotiating with the major carriers. And so the concepts that I'm going to share with you this afternoon are a direct result of our participation in that consortium. So, what are we actually talking about? And I won't go through this, but what you can see is the left side of this definition is really talking about that box that was on the top of the wood pole that Joe showed you. And we saw one in real life at one of these meetings. They're not particularly big. They're as big as a large binder about. But the idea is that there would be an awful lot of these in particular situations. So left side of the screen is sort of defining the antenna. The right side of the screen is talking about all of the other stuff that goes with that particular antenna. The key here for you, I've cited both the RCW and the municipal code that has that definition. We'll find that same definition into federal law as well. So we're all starting from a common point, I think, is what I want to impress upon you. So there are a number of things which could be influencing what kind of code we might put together. The existing regulatory framework that we have to operate inside, of course, is always a starting point. The council's franchise authority versus our land use permit authority. Both of those are necessary, both of those are good, but we have benefits to one over the other in certain circumstances. Are we talking about brand new construction of a whole new facility like that example that was the mock-up for Texas? Or are we talking about expansions of existing facilities? And then where are those facilities located? The big conversation, the big push, what we've been hearing is really all about the public rights of way. And if we think about it, that makes sense. Because if the carriers have to negotiate these on a private property, they have to negotiate a lease with every private property owner they're trying to put this on. And that's a cumbersome and certainly an expensive process. And then finally, sort of picking up where Joe left off with some of it, is the physical appearance of the facilities. And what does that mean to us in terms of design standards that the community might want to see? I found it actually kind of interesting that the rules that we're dealing with respect to this particular technology was found in something that was actually called the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012. It's also known as the Spectrum Act. In fact, you'll see that referenced in codes. In our own code references the Spectrum Act. It's codified at that particular U.S. code section. A couple of key pieces in there for you. One is that this federal law really dictated that we have to approve requests to modify existing towers or base stations that don't substantially change their physical appearance. As you can imagine, there's an awful lot of text that helps us decide what substantially change means or not. But the takeaway there is that the FCC has said you have to approve these things, and you have to do it quickly. And that's the 60-day shot clock, generally 60 days, there's some other times. And that's where that shot clock concept comes in. Once we've got an application, we have to move on it very, very quickly. So if we look at Washington State, of course we have some existing RCW that will inform our process here. Mrs. Munns mentioned that the last legislative session, the communications industry tried to introduced a bill trying to preempt local authority. It was not successful, but we do expect that they will try again this session, and that is the conventional wisdom at this point. So the pressure is on AWC to show that they're working to help develop a compromise bill, and we also think that there's some pressure to show that the cities have begun to address this in advance of that legislation coming forward, hence our participation in the consortium. That takes me to our code. As you probably would expect, our code is not completely silent on communication facilities. Chapter 1929 is the one that does the monopoles, right, or regular cell tower antennas placed on buildings. The 1930 chapter, that's the one that responds to the Spectrum Act. That's where we introduced the shot clock concept into our code, and it's the one that mandates that we have to respond very quickly to those applications to modify existing structures. And it was written at a time that anticipated the need for small cells as modifications, so we see some language in there already. But we also then need some additional code to address small cell facilities. We might do that as its own piece of code. We might do it integrated into that chapter 1929. So earlier on, I mentioned that there are two ways that the council can regulate these things. One is through your franchise authority. The other is through land use permits. Franchise agreements, some key points. Typically, the courts defer to the council and your authority in that area, your contract authority. And so that's a pretty attractive way for us to look at determining how and where these types of things will be built in Oak Harbor. That allows you to act as your role as stewards of the public rights of way. And again, you exercise your contract authority in that. Compare that to land use permits. But before you go on that, so what we anticipate, and I think I have another slide that's going to discuss this. What we anticipate is that the lion's share of determining what will they look like, where will they go, What color do they have to be? Are there special design standards? When will we allow them to co-locate or not? All of these types of decisions, we would negotiate that through the franchise agreement, your contract authority, and set it up in such a fashion then that the permitting is very simple because we've already agreed to 90% of what the meat of the issue is, okay? What we would do with the land use permits is we would reserve those for those situations which are outside of what we were able to anticipate and to negotiate. So maybe those are things which are in the underground areas where we've got to go underground. We didn't have the standards for those. New poles, because our approach will likely be to discourage new poles, but where it's absolute necessity, it should go through a different kind of permitting process. And then when we're in places like shorelines or other critical areas, it's going to be more appropriate for us to use the land use permit process. So you might remember that we recently updated the franchise code, and it basically, when we utilize that code, gives us the opportunity to identify the location and types of facilities, and in this case, the types of small cells where they would be. The application that we get from them requires a lot of detailed information. So once we've negotiated the franchise, then we get this very detailed application that tells us how they're going to meet all of the standards which are in the franchise. We will negotiate with them for that agreement. On that one, we have 120 days to get council action in terms of putting the franchise into place. And again, it's your legislative authority. Subsequent applications where we want to build this thing here and this thing here, those will be in that 60-day time frame or less. So here are some examples of how this approval process could work. So for instance, are they meeting the conditions of the franchise agreement? If the answer to that is yes, it's going to be a very simple administrative permit. What we've worked on is the right-of-way permit. Are there minor modifications to what we've agreed upon in the franchise? Likely still will be that administrative permit. Are there major modifications, new pole, private property? That's going to push us into the land use side of things, and we're going to stay out of the franchise side of things. Recognize that Joe had these pictures in his portion of the presentation, but I wanted to circle back to them to point out some of the things that will be important from a design perspective. So, how do we want to handle ground-mounted cabinets and equipment? Are there standards about where those should be placed? Obviously, they're going to want to have them within the right-of-way, but how do we integrate that in such a manner that doesn't deteriorate the pedestrian experience? Do they need to be somehow matched to other furnitures within the area? And I'm thinking particularly within the downtown area, so where we have special standards. Like on the right-hand side here, where we have unique light poles within the downtown, how do we allow connection to that? What should that look like? Will we allow ground-mounted cabinets, or will we require the use of a pole that somehow gets the brains of it, I think as Joe said, all into the cabinet, into the base of the pole, so that as a pedestrian, you're not stuck dealing with all of these ground-mounted units. In the more traditional installation, what are our color requirements? Are there unique areas in the community where we should have special standards? The downtown is one, maybe along the highway is another. Maybe there's some other areas where we don't think there are unique standards, and so we develop more of a uniform standard for it. So the franchise agreement will have some of that in there. Some of it we may deal then within our code, in our standards. And then some of those could be permit by permit decisions when we get into the land use permit side of things. So here are some of the key concepts then to try to summarize these points. We want to take advantage of the court's deference to your legislative and contract powers. If we treat those small cells in the rights of way like other utilities and don't have them as land use decisions, that also means that they're not subject to the land use appeal provisions. And that has some benefits to us from a processing standpoint. We're going to advocate for a process which uses administrative decisions wherever possible. Again, let's hammer out the majority of this up front. Everything else is sort of a check. Are we in line with these things, yes or no? We're going to encourage the use of existing pools. Most of the communities that are working on this are highly discouraging the construction of new pools, just so that we don't clutter our built environment with more pools than are necessary. I think from our staff's perspective, we want to work inside of our existing code framework to the degree that we can. And the ones which will get the greatest scrutiny, you can see there again, new pools, significant deviations from agreed upon standards, or those special areas like our downtown. Where we think we go from here, we're working right now with the subject matter experts from the Ogden Murphy Wallace legal firm. They're helping us with our draft code. Likely we will schedule an additional briefing for you when we get to the point where we need some help with some policy choices. Do you prefer A or B kind of a thing? And then we would anticipate getting into the public adoption process with the Public Notification Planning Commission, City Council. And I would say that this is one of those projects where we want to sort of keep the pedal to the metal, with the idea that we want to try to be well underway before the legislative session starts, so that we can have something on the books hopefully before, if something were to be adopted at the state. And I think that's it in terms of slides. Yes, Mr. Campbell. Yeah.
Maybe we should have scheduled this for half an hour. Councilor Weiser.
Yes, I am. So just sort of, I just jotted this down. When you're talking about aesthetics and boxes or having it in the base, and just to go back to our last presentation about Main Street and what we can do specifically in areas where we're trying to be attractive to our visitors. If we're gonna have to do this and have a box or something, why don't we take advantage of that and make it in a flower pot? Make it part of a bicycle rack. You know, if it's in like our main, a main street, if you will, I'm using that term funny, but like if it's literally on our main street or on Midway or somewhere where we know there's businesses and there's traffic, and somewhere where we can feasibly get water to flower pot, or make it something that's more attractive than just a box. We can use it in a way, you know, another way, and that may be hard to put in a code, but maybe not. If there's a way to word it that if you're gonna have to put one of these on our sidewalk, that's heavily traffic sidewalk right in front of somebody's business, that it has to be somehow usable. It can't just be a concrete box or a metal box or whatever it is. And that may be something that we can do to make it more attractive or more inviting, if there's a way to do that feasibly. Another thing I thought of, talking about like a really tall, like the one in Texas, having to go up hundreds of feet. Are they looking at like Memorial Stadium probably has, I don't know how tall of light poles. You know, I mean, I don't know. I know a lot of that is school district property, obviously, but maybe there are some areas that we have where we already have really tall poles to not have to build something super tall if needed, like you said, to get into those. And then also, if it came down to a land use where somebody did want to build a new pole, could you get through a land use process in 60 days?
Those are not subject to the same shot clock provisions.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So what happens to the communities that want to put all the wires and everything underground? I mean, look how much better Pioneer Way looks, because we took all those lines and put them underground. It just looks cleaner. It gives a more definite aesthetic view for our town. Yeah, between that and one of the other choices.
So you'll still have, I mean, we will
Right.
still have light poles, right?
Right.
And so that's why I think one of the reasons why it's most attractive to the carriers is because they know that infrastructure's there, and that infrastructure is in the public rights of way. So the wire part of it, yes, I think you want to have that minimized as much as possible. There'll probably be some instances where that wire can't go underground. Something that we didn't talk about is the backhaul. Is that?
Yeah. Well, that's the fiber back to the main tower.
Because these things don't function by themselves. They have to be tied back to that main tower. And so somehow there's that physical connection between this thing and the main tower. So how is that wire or that cable getting there? And that's part of one of the things we're concerned about is the undergrounding in our community, given the prevalence of cultural resources. So how do we address those issues with the undergrounding of the wires? Not saying that we don't want to have it happen, but what are the standards that we have to put in place in that franchise agreement to make sure that those things are done appropriately?
You know, I think we're going to have even more questions than we probably have time for. I wonder if this is a topic that we could have another presentation on. You know,
We anticipated as such.
I'm certainly
so-
wondering about revenue, you know, how I think.
Sure,
What are
sure.
our opportunities? I think there's lots of questions.
Yeah,
that-
we'd be happy to do it again.
Okay. Why don't we plan to do that then in the
Thanks for
near
your time.
future? Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we're just a touch past 4 here, and I think our next presentation is, if I read this correctly, e-cigarettes / vaping. And Councilor Hizon has invited some very knowledgeable folks from our county. I see Mr. Higman, and he can introduce his guest. So welcome, Keith Higman,
Thank you.
Public Health Director for Island County.
Thank you for having us today. I'm joined today by Laura Luganbill. Laura is our Director of Assessment and Healthy Communities. We do a fair amount of work related to tobacco and the implications of tobacco and marijuana. We have funding associated with both of those streams. Maybe I should start by reminding you all that we're your health department as well. We're a county, city joint health department funded through a variety of mechanisms, but we are one of the few county departments that has jurisdiction inside the city limits. We inspect your restaurants. There are 200 or so septic systems that still exist within the city that we're responsible for. We deliver WIC services to residents of Oak Harbor, immunization services, a variety of things, and are delighted to be here today and to attend any future conversations you have that you want to discuss issues related to public health and the implications of your policy decisions on the health of your communities. We did not come today prepared with a presentation. We were reached out and invited to attend today to help you with the conversation that you may wish to have about policies, procedures, ordinances that you may wish to evaluate as it relates to smoking and/or e-cigarettes, vaping, both in public places and indoors and outdoors. There are 2 different statutes that are involved in smoking, implementation of the Smoking in Public Places Act voter initiative that affects in what kinds of facilities and what places indoors you can legally consume lighted tobacco products, and a separate statute that affects the public's use of e-cigarettes and vaping products, both in public and private settings. We have reviewed what I think is the ordinance and regulation that you have adopted previously that affects where people can consume lighted tobacco products outdoors related to the entrances to parks and playfields, and are here today at the request of one of your council members to address any questions you have or participate in whatever conversations you may be interested in having with us.
Councilor Hizon.
I don't know if you guys remember, but it was back in February when the Oak Harbor Youth Coalition came in and during public comment asked us to have this conversation. And the ask is that we add e-cigarettes and vaping to the existing smoking ordinance. That's literally what they asked for. So adding e-cigarettes and vaping, the words, and defining them obviously in the existing ordinance, because like Keith mentioned, there's 2 separate statutes, and the one on vaping and e-cigarettes it just applies to smoking in childcare facilities, schools, school buses, elevators. So like Erica could be billowing clouds of smoke right next to me here in council chambers, and there's no rule that says that can't happen. You know, somebody could be smoking in the grocery store, the movie theater, and that just common sense would dictate that we should have something on the books. And I think people assume that it's basically treated the same as a lighted cigarette, which is good because it doesn't seem to be, you know, much of an issue, but it just seems like common sense to put something on the books and add that to the ordinance for a number of public health and environmental reasons.
There is preemption language in the statute as it relates to vaping. And so for a political subdivision of the state to consider controlling the use of vapor products in outdoor places, you'd have to limit it to places where children congregate. That's the one limitation. There are no such limitations on regulating the use of vapor products in indoor public spaces. So there's some intention on behalf of the legislature to not tie your hands as a political subdivision if you so choose to extend what would be the Smoking in Public Places Act into other public places under your jurisdiction. But clearly a policy decision of this political subdivision.
So what has the town of Coopville done?
I'm going to let Laura present on that because she and her staff worked significantly with the town council in Coopville.
Right. And I have the language here, the town council, of Coopville Town Council. So they expanded the language of their existing ordinance to specifically include e-cigarettes. And so their ordinance currently reads, smoking and use of smoke-free tobacco is not allowed in town buildings or on town-owned property. Smoking is defined and goes on to say inhaling, exhaling, burning, or carrying a lighted or vapor-producing product or using smoke-free tobacco products, and then goes on to list specific products that are include but are not limited to cigarettes, chew, electronic cigarettes, cigars, cigarillos, hookahs, and marijuana. So they expanded their language to specifically include e-cigarettes as part of their smoke-free ordinance on town property.
Would you read again? That's town property, right? Town. What were the three? Town property.
Not
town
allowed
bill?
in town buildings or on town-owned property.
Okay.
That included particularly targeting their parks and town-owned parking lots.
The action they took was limited.
That would also,
Which is, I mean, that's a tactic we can use, but it would make sense to include indoor spaces. Oh, and sorry, I'm going to interrupt you, Keith. To back up, the reason that there's a couple of reasons. The reason that the Youth Coalition specifically has identified this as a concern is because the Surgeon General just put out a 239-page report or something specifically on the fact that this is a public health issue for kids, teenagers. Usage of these products, it's become more prevalent, and it's gone up like 900% since 2011. And when these products were introduced, they were sold to us as, oh, it just expels water vapor. That's all it is. You can totally do it indoors. It's perfectly safe. But now that they've been out for a few years and testing has been done, that's actually not true. It's not just water vapor. It's something that people in general shouldn't be exposed to secondhand. And then there's also just the visual environmental, when young people are exposed to something, it normalizes it and sends the message that it's safe. So that's the reason. If it was water vapor, I don't think anybody would care. But the fact that it isn't and that it is a health risk is the reason that we care, I guess. Does that make sense, Keith?
yeah, that I would just add for the comparison to the town of Coopville, by identifying Coopville property, it would extend the ban to the property where the sewage treatment facility is located, which is also adjacent to a park and a boat ramp. But there's also been a conversation in Coopville about do sidewalks on Front Street constitute town-owned property?
I was going to ask you that.
And so they're struggling with that, and I don't know if Laura has anything to add, to that. But that question is now being asked because of the definition they used for town-owned property. And if extended to the sidewalks, it then impacts their smoking in public places law, which states 25 feet from any opening of a public building or window or ventilation intake. I don't know if you have anything.
No, I
there.
don't have any
But
updates on there.
that's one issue that they're dealing with right now.
Councilor Olmberg.
You've used the term e-cigarettes and vapes, or whatever. What's the difference? They're the same thing, just one and the same?
Sort of. The e-cigarettes are just the little, they look like cigarettes and expel a small amount of smoke. Vaping is a different product. Have you ever been driving your car and you see a car with all of the smoke
vape
coming out the
coming
windows?
out.
That's vaping.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we had one of those.
It's like the adult equivalent of blowing bubbles.
One of the buses, transit district had one on the bus. Somebody on the bus was messing with their battery on their vaping, and it exploded and shot up into the dashboard and actually started a fire in the dashboard of the bus. Well, those types of devices are not permitted on a transit now.
And the reason that happens is because people are modifying them. They're modifying them to make more and more smoke. So it's
There
anyway,
is
we
an
probably get into it,
argument
but
that it's not really smoke, but that's
it's vapor.
vapor. Is same with the e-cigarettes? Are they vapor?
It's vapor.
But as e-cigarettes and vapor products have been on the market, more and more testing has been done. Up until 2016, no producer was required to list the ingredients within within the liquid that was being sold. That's changed, but these compounds, as they're aerosolized, as they're heated, they change. And so more research is coming out about what is found within e-cigarette liquid. And that's where the concern about the public use of these products comes from. So aerosolized e-cigarettes, as the testing has come out, some contain diacetyl, which will cause significant harm to the lungs. Some will contain heavy metals, such as lead, that is aerosolized. There are carcinogens that can be found in the vapor. Again, because they're not tightly regulated, the ingredients must be listed. The research is new. These are new products, but we do know that they're not harmless and that they do contain compounds that are known to cause health problems. And that's, again, getting to Councilmember Hizon's concern is an issue that this is a public health concern.
Councilor Servades.
You know, I would very much support looking into this. It wasn't that long ago. I don't know do we have an ordinance that speaks to this? We passed a resolution, because I recall helping Mike Wright and the Parks Board, we put up a bunch of the signs. There was a joint venture between Island County and some funding that was acquired for these signs that we put up that said, for our kids' sake, you see them around. For our kids' sake, please don't smoke near trails or parks. But it wasn't an ordinance, it was a strong
I'm certainly not an expert on your code, but I went online in preparation for today, and code reference 6.12110 states it's unlawful and a misdemeanor for any person to use tobacco products within 25 feet of the entrance to any park facility and within 25 feet of any athletic facility in a park.
So the last part of that, and I can go read it, was an entrance, somebody in the middle of Windjammer.
Within 25 feet of the entrance to any park facility, and I was not part of this conversation,
Right.
or within 25 feet of any athletic facility in a park.
Okay.
And this,
So for me, I guess I would be interested, I was in the doctor's office and I'm gonna get a picture of it. It was for smoking cessation was the poster, but it's, I forget how it's where basically all the places you can't smoke, and it started with an airplane. It wasn't that long ago. You could, I mean, think about that. It's kind of, and it went through all these reasons, and it ended up being, hey, it's probably you that needs to change, or would you consider, smoking cessation, whatever. So it was a fairly effective poster, and so I think as times have changed and we know more about these products, I'd like to take another look at this, because when we looked at it probably a couple years ago with that resolution and we got those signs made, if you go through Windjammer, a lot of those signs have been beaten up. I've been down at Fort Nugent where we put them on the back of every bleacher, and you'll have people standing next to the bleachers smoking. And so if it's not, I mean, maybe there is an ordinance here. It's enforcement's fairly difficult, but I think it's worth taking another look at.
Councilor Watson.
If our ordinance says tobacco products, again, I don't have the ordinance in front of me, but are e-cigarettes and vaping tobacco products? Like, does that term encompass e-cigs and vaping, or just old cigarettes and chew?
You'll have to consult with your
Legal.
legal counsel. My opinion is no.
So you
My
don't think
opinion is
it's not a
this is a
tobacco product?
liquid that contains the chemicals that tobacco might also contain, but it is not tobacco based. It's not a tobacco based product.
Some
And-
things lump it together, but it's a
Separate.
And there is 4 cities and counties that are wishing to clarify their language. There is very easy examples of language that could be added to an ordinance that would clarify and include e-cigarettes. And that's Change Lab Solutions, which does a lot of policy recommendations, has some specific language that has been adopted by several cities. Whatcom, Snohomish, Tacoma Health, or Tacoma Pierce County has adopted additional language. There's King County,
City of Arlington.
City of Arlington. Those are some in the area that have adopted additional language.
So our Board of Health, had a presentation about this.
We did. We staffed it.
And yes, and was there was no decision made, I do know that.
There was no decision made, and so we staffed those conversations, as you're aware, because you're a member of the board. Where I think the County Board of Health stumbled a bit was in the concept of how do you enforce this on properties that in the county and county park system are thousands of acres of property. And so if you passed a resolution that said it's a misdemeanor, civil infraction, whatever the penalty would be for violating a ban on smoking or vapor products, who's going to enforce that? And our sheriff was pretty vocal that it wasn't going to be him. And I think that's kind of where the conversation, our board of county commissioners have had conversations around establishing a tobacco-free campus. Whidbey Health has established a tobacco-free campus. The concept of enforcement was once again sort of a driver in that conversation, unfortunately, because it's really the behavior change rather than the enforcement that you're interested in affecting.
So can you still vape at Whidbey Health?
I don't know the answer to that question.
I don't either. I don't want to misspeak on that.
I will get you an answer, and you
Well,
can share
I'm
it
not
with
interested.
council. I don't know.
Really, I'm just curious. We had an event downtown, Oktoberfest, and I worked for the Rotary Club, and there was it was right in the middle of our street. The street was closed, of course, and active band playing, and lots of people down there. And there were 2 people that were vaping like crazy, and it was not. They were upsetting some people, and it didn't bother them, I guess, and I wondered whether they were going to get into a scuffle, but it was obviously just. Nobody's smoking. Nobody was smoking cigarettes, but these 2 people were vaping, and it was annoying.
The provisions in the state law about when vaping is prohibited in a child care facility, in a school, within 500 feet of schools, school buses, elevators, that makes sense. In outdoor areas, real property that's under the control of a child care facility while it's operating, real property that's under the control of a school and upon which the school is located, and playgrounds during the hours between sunrise and sunset when 1 or more persons under 12 years of age are present at such playground. So in the statute, those are the only limitations in terms of outdoor vaping.
And that, I assume, would cover the e-cigarettes too. Yeah, okay. So, anyone else got any input or questions or thoughts? Okay.
Does anybody have, an opinion about?
Councilor Munns?
I guess a question, yes, the enforcement for a lot of things is hard to do, but at least if it's on the books, it's some place to start. So if you have Oktoberfest, and you can tell some people, I mean, it's not that hard, there's a policeman around somewhere to either say, put it away or move out of the area. It doesn't mean you have to arrest them or to fine them or whatever, but if it isn't even on the books, then you have nowhere to start. Yes, there are a lot of things that are really hard to enforce, but at least if they're there, it's a starting point. So if there is a special run at one of the parks, and then you have observers there, you've kind of got your audience right there. You could enforce it at that time and just say, politely say, okay, we have an ordinance, either put it away or move on. So I would think we ought to at least check, and I bet MRSC has some ideas for us. If you haven't checked them, it's free. Anybody can call.
Yeah, we're active members.
Yeah.
Councilor Watson?
So,
So back to the enforcement in Island County, kind of worried about that aspect is what I'm gathering, that they didn't take any action on it. So in Island County, in an Island County owned park or outdoor area, are you allowed to smoke like tobacco, regular cigarettes?
So, yes, you are allowed to.
Okay, so in Island County, there just is no regulation, ban on smoking, in their properties.
There is the implementation of the Smoking in Public Places Act, just like it occurs in the city of Oak Harbor.
Yeah.
The Island County Commissioners have not extended that beyond the way it sits in the statute.
The state statute, or federal, is it state or federal?
State.
State statute.
Yeah.
And that's all we're asking the council to consider, is to just add
the words
e-cigarette and
e-cigarettes
vaping
and
products
vaping.
to the existing. Because the enforcement thing, I'm sorry, that's
Yeah.
a cop out. I mean, there's already existing smoking ordinance. Nobody's worried about enforcing that, but you're right, just having something on the books is.
So
a step.
also part of that conversation, and I'm not, this is not finger pointing, there are more cities that are considering adopting or extending these regulations really due to the issues related to density and exposure. There are just more people that live in cities. There's bigger crowds in cities. There's more congregations of people in cities. And I just share that because it was also part of the county conversation about if you're walking your dog at Double Bluff, how often do you come within close proximity to anybody else that's walking their dog at Double Bluff? And that's a county park, and that's why I use this as an example. So we have seen more city conversations across the state than we've seen county conversations across the state.
I was just, I thank you, Keith, I had found this, it was ordinance 1669 was the last time we took a look at this, which was October 2013. So it's time. And it's so vague in there without the word of, or including e-cigarettes or vaping or even, it doesn't reference, sorry, I was going to break, it reference actual tobacco, so, chewing tobacco. But it's so vague, there's nothing to permit or prohibit someone from, and I've been down there at 4th of July, military appreciation picnic in the food line behind somebody with a cigar. And I'm like, So it might be, it's definitely worth time to probably revisit that.
Anyone else? Councilmember?
I have another question, totally separate from this. And that is, we had this conversation on the telephone regarding the windmill. I left a message for Joe Stowell. We have directions to the council.
Yeah, I think we are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
You're
Laura.
welcome another invitation.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for coming north.
We have direction to the staff that we are going to modify it or blow it down. And I did a visual inspection of that thing, and I'm not saying that our staff doesn't know what they're doing. That isn't at all what I'm saying. Is from the visual standpoint, I have a very difficult time justifying my decision to say, well, let's possibly tear it down. And I wish that we could take another look at that, because what I see from the ground level, I see potentially $100,000 repair to that thing versus tearing it down, spending a lot of money to tear it down and rebuild it, when I used to think we could be throwing good money after bad by trying to salvage it. I'm not so convinced about that right now.
Okay.
How do we get that, how do we put that on pause until we have a chance to really look at it in better detail?
That we have a council action was taken, correct?
We,
Yeah.
right, we talked about it today at the meeting this morning. Right now, we have a council action on that. So councils would have to decide what you want to do there and what steps you would like to direct staff on that. So we can put that on the agenda for our next meeting. We can do something like that if you want to have that conversation.
I would like to see it on the agenda so that we can really take a look at it. Looking at those photos is convincing with the screwdrivers through something, but what I'm looking at is not convincing.
Okay, well, Councilor Holmberg called me. I trust his construction knowledge, his experience in that area, and so I only know that there was an action taken, and I don't know where staff is on that, and I kind of defer this to you.
Yeah, I'll find out exactly where we're at, but I think we're actually moving along in that. So if we want to put that on pause, we'll have to do that right away, and then try to bring back that as soon as we can.
So it's not on our agenda to discuss this, and we don't make decisions at a meeting like this,
Right.
so.
But as mayor, you could put pause on it with the follow-up that we have on the next agenda for the council.
And I'd be happy to do that if I have that power.
Yeah, that's fine. We could do that. I think what would be helpful is that meeting, what findings you have or information you have, so we can have a good discussion on that and then look at options.
For me personally, and I'm not saying and I'll say this again, I trust our staff. And I'm not saying I'm the expert on this stuff. I just tried to look for areas that I was told were problems, big structural problems. I didn't observe that. And I'm looking at that handrail and I recognize that there's probably rot on the cap rail on that thing because it's a horizontal member. The mid rails are pressure treated. The deck probably needs to be replaced. But I'm not convinced that blowing that whole thing down, tearing it down, pay to tear it down, and then to rebuild it someplace else, I would be more inclined to really see what the cost is to salvage that and put money into building another one someplace, if that's gonna be
Well,
our.
I'm going to make a command decision here then. I recall that resolution was worded such that even staff had the option to dismantle that. It wasn't like a total tear down. So I think that I'd like to just hold on that until Mr. Almberg can be satisfied, if that's possible, if that doesn't create a huge problem.
Okay, I will check on that, and then we can pencil in this on the agenda. We'll bring that resolution back so you can see it. We'll get everybody a copy of that so you can review that, and maybe some elements of the staff presentation.
Or in the meantime, perhaps Mr. Almberg
And
could,
I really would like to have a meeting with
he's trying to
with the engineering department.
communicate with
and-
Joe.
And Hank Needham, and I'd like to get into the building, because what I'm saying is my observation, my inspection was just an observation. That's all. There's a lot of hidden stuff. So on the outside, I'm not convinced that it's worth tearing it down. There may be conditions on the inside that justify tearing it down.
The only thing I want to throw into the mix real quick if I could is, isn't a long-term goal is it doesn't go there?
Right.
Well, and that is another situation to look at too, because, and I looked at that, and again, we don't have plans in front of us. I know we have that grading that has to come out to that area. However, it is not an unlikely possibility to have an architectural retaining feature like rockery or Allen blocks or something around the perimeter of that thing that allows you to transition from the fill from that area down. I don't know. I'm not trying to redesign this thing. I'm just trying to go by, is the decision being made because it's in the way? Or is it being made because it's deteriorated beyond reasonableness to salvage it? And from a salvage standpoint, what I see, I don't think it's reasonable to just say, let's knock it down. And I want to be on record on that.
Include the structural engineer's report?
I understand that.
So we have our Public Works Director here. I'm gonna let her.
So where we're at with that project right now is we've removed the hazards. We're
Correct.
getting some lead and asbestos testing, which has to be done before we can get a demo permit. We have talked about the possibility of moving it, but the very first thing that we need to figure out before we decide if we're going to move it or tear it down is where is it going to go? If it's going to go someplace that requires us to remove traffic signals out of the way and those kinds of things, it may not be worth moving it. So we are not moving very quickly on demoing it because we really want to figure out, and Hank was going to talk to the movers when they were in town, the house movers, when they were in town moving the old Ely house. But that didn't happen. He wanted them to take a look at it to see if they could move it, give us a cost estimate on what that would be. But we really do need to, if it's just going to go somewhere else in the park, maybe not such a big deal. If it's going to go someplace else in town, we really need to think about that. So the first step, I think, would be to figure out where we want to have the windmill.
Before it's destroyed.
Yes.
Councilor Munns?
And I think another question is, it is an icon because you can still easily see it. But when the new building and stuff is done, I think it's going to be hidden, so it's not our icon anymore unless you're physically inside the park. So,
Well-
that's another thing is people are yapping because it's an icon. Oh my gosh, but it's not historic, it's not, we have plans that we can build the same one just with better materials. But if we're going to put it where the ball fields are or on the roundabout, and I think the answer from the structural engineers was it couldn't physically be moved. We all were hot to trot to physically pick it up and just move it. But then they were saying, that's too much money, it's not going to work.
Well, when you
So-
say,
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's,
Yeah.
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 Yeah, we're certainly not gonna take any
Right,
action, I
right.
guess. That's
But anyway, that's the
certainly
question
important.
is,
before that term is we're hot to trot to move it, that doesn't speak for me because I see a CMU building there that it could be moved, but very expensive and a high-risk building to move. It's a high-risk building to move, and I've actually moved buildings. I'm not in the moving business, but that is one that I'd be that'd be very susceptible to structural damage to the lower frame of that building for what you'd get out of it. If it is salvageable, reasonably salvageable, to leave it there and it's worked within the plan, I would rather, and I think we're talking about in the range of $100,000 to modify it, to reconstruct those parts that need to be reconstructed. I would rather put new money in building another one where we want it and use new material and not throw our money into trying to tear that thing down and destroy it just to go have one. What's wrong with having two down there? What's wrong with having those picnic kitchens that are shaped like the windmills like we have up in the Holland Park up there?
I think the master plan in that area shows a performance stage.
In that particular area?
In that area,
I thought that
yes.
was off to the right of that, no?
There's two.
Well, anyway,
I think we're out of our rules for our meeting by doing any more on the subject. We've got an agenda, and we're not supposed to be making any decisions or talking about anything else.
The last thing on the agenda is
city council.
That's what I thought that
Yeah.
city council was for.
Can
That's
talk about-
been added to every
It says
workshop.
city council,
That's just 'cause-
E-cig and vaping.
That's just because I requested something specific.
We have been having council discussion at the end of these.
Yeah,
From 4 to
that's what
5.
workshops are for.
Anyway,
Yeah.
you know what?
Dr.
Some
Brown.
other questions?
Yeah,
Wait a minute.
I can help you guys out on that one. When we changed the times and everything on this, the purpose is starting at 2 instead of 3. So it's at 4 o'clock, it was an open session for council to bring up different things they want to talk about.
Okay. So, sounds like we're moving slow for a lot of good reasons.
Yes.
Sounds like you can get some more information and some
I
more
would just
answers.
like to meet with Joe
Sure.
and probably Brian Shirley. And I'd like to get into the building and with Hank Knight and Kathy, and I don't want to make this just a big city powwow down there. Last week, I just happened to be walking around this thing, just looking at it with a critical eye. What I could see from the ground did not convince me that from just a structural point of view, to tear it down. And unfortunately, Bob just called me about something else, and I had him as a captive audience, so he had to listen to me for a minute. That's where this went.
Councilor Wassinger, did you want to say?
Oh, I did. And again, you're right. I think this is appropriate to put on a council meeting agenda if potential action be taken. But, you know, for me, Ian, my thinking was the reason I voted to go ahead and remove it after seeing the pictures and seeing the safety hazards was that we've been through the public process on this. We adopted a resolution in June of 16 after 9 months of an intensive public process to develop a master plan for that entire park. So my decisions and actions were to move forward with that plan, not sideways or backwards. And in that plan, it very clearly states in phase 2 that the windmill is to be relocated or rebuilt. It's very specific in phase 2. So that was my thinking on it. And I would like to know in the council meeting, maybe something you can add if we do add it as an agenda, is what is it? Because when we took action, I didn't see a fiscal impact put anywhere about removing it. But maybe if there is a fiscal impact, if it is costing a significant amount of money for us to tear it down as it is, and do the process that you're doing now, what is that fiscal impact to the city? I would like to know that.
I think the demo would occur, and we've been thinking about this, but it would occur with the demo of the other park structures. So it won't be that expensive to demo that if that's the way we go.
And I would concur with that. I look at that and think we probably $25,000 or $30,000, not including any lead or asbestos, with the excavator to knock it down, crunch it, put it in the dumpster truck, and it's gone. But what I would have problem with is telling the public we have no use for this, and I recognize that it's in this master plan, but we have two things to do trying to do this master plan: come up with money, which means save money somehow. We may even have to modify our master plan to some capacity if it actually helps promote better use of the money and better design, or as good design in the park. And I would not want to just sit and say to the general public, well, we tore it down because we just thought it was a good idea, and then spend $500,000 to build the same thing someplace else. I'd rather put money into building another one someplace else and have two of them, if that worked in the plan.
Other input or questions? Thoughts? Okay. Seeing none, I guess we're adjourned. Thank you very much. Good conversation. Thank you.